Good morning. So hi everyone, I'm Robin Lyshenko. I'm a professor and chair in the Department of Geography here, and I also co-direct the Rutgers Climate Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this year's Climate Symposium, where our theme this year is Science and Society, Perspectives on a Green New Deal. So I'll be presiding over the sort of symposium today, but before we get to all the matters at hand, I want to just introduce my co-director, Tony Broccoli, who is professor and chair in the Department of Environmental Sciences.
Thank you very much, Robin, and thanks to everyone who's here this morning. I'd like to add my welcome. It's nice to see so many people here early in the morning. So I don't have a whole lot to do today other than to enjoy all the talks and discussions, but my one task that I'd like to do right now is to introduce Bob Goodman, the Executive Dean of the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, who will give some welcoming remarks. Bob has been a longtime supporter of the Rutgers Climate Institute, going back to its earliest days as the Rutgers Climate and Environmental Change Initiative. We are very grateful for his support and look forward to hearing what he has to say this morning. Bob?
Thank you, Tony. Well, this is quite a turnout. I'm delighted to be here to see all of you. Tony mentioned the beginnings of this, a conference, I think it was in 2006. By my count, this is the 14th annual Climate Symposium here. That initial meeting was a meeting that brought together people on the Rutgers campuses. I'll miss a couple by trying to recite examples of the disciplines that were represented at that first meeting, but it certainly included geography and geological sciences, as it was, I believe, then, philosophy, sociology. We're in the room, marine and coastal sciences, human ecology, environmental sciences, ecology, evolution, and natural resources, landscape architecture. The seeds were planted that year. The initiative got started. The Climate Institute flowed from that. The Institute for Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, a much more recent innovation, has its roots in that. So the seeds were planted in 2006. Now we have a robust carbon sequestering tree that is rooted deeply in the rich living soil of Rutgers University. And I congratulate all of you on what you've accomplished, and I'm delighted to be here. So as most of you know, the Green New Deal is legislation that's been introduced in Congress. There is a very deep and strong connection between what we do in the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences here at Rutgers, as well as in the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, which I lead. So the Green New Deal has been proposed in the House of Representatives. It's predicated on the IPCC's report on global warming and of 1.5 degrees C and the fourth National Climate Assessment. The foundations of these reports are the basics, arise from the science, from the collective scholarship of natural and social scientists around the world, conducting research, publishing their work, and having conferences like this to talk about the issues. Our work, your work, has been and continues to be critical in understanding how the climate system works, how it's been changing, how it's projected to change, and what these profound changes mean to the terrestrial, aquatic, and marine systems, our food systems, our health, our infrastructure, and our economics. It also means supporting research to address greenhouse gas emissions, and as well as how to adapt to the changes that are already wired into the climate system. And of course, we're educating students, as well as the broader public, to take us into a future in which we need to achieve zero net emissions by 2050. So we're here today to think about these issues, how best to secure clean air, water, resiliency of our climate and our communities, healthy food, access to nature, aesthetics, and a sustainable environment. These topics are the daily focus of our staff and students and faculty. They also call, in my mind, into question a broader question about governance. All of the issues that we address when we think about the climate system transcend traditional sovereignty boundaries laid in the last several centuries of human affairs. How do we govern globally when the issues that we face are global issues, but the way we govern ourselves is much more fragmented or granular? As the land-grant institution for New Jersey, we here at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, have still the mission to link our research to our extension and outreach programs to take our science to the public and to the world. I hope today's symposium will not only reveal new ideas and bring forth new understandings, but also to build and strengthen the collaborations that need to exist amongst all of our institutions in the region and the people and the governing systems of the region, and the corporate sector as well, the public sector. So thank you for being here. Thank you for what you do. Have a great day. It's going to be cold and gray outside, so it's a good day to be inside. Thanks.
Thank you for those introductory comments, Bob. As Dean Goodman already noted, the cited reports that the Green New Deal is predicated on are scientific reports that were put together by interdisciplinary teams of scientists. So interdisciplinarity is definitely a critical theme of the Rutgers Climate Institute. We have scientists, social scientists, folks from humanities, engineers, doctors, lawyers. We sort of have the entire suite of the university. And it's really sort of doing that kind of interdisciplinary work is really something that we hope isn't just sort of something that goes into symposia like this, but actually it's something that we hope comes out, some new ideas for interdisciplinary scholarship. So with that, I'm based in the School of Arts and Sciences, and it's my pleasure to introduce Peter March. Peter's the Executive Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, and I want to especially thank Dean March for the continuing support of the Climate Institute.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Robin. So on behalf of the School of Arts and Sciences, it's also my pleasure to welcome you all here. You should feel fully welcomed at this point. So I'm a mathematician, and I specialize in probability theory, randomness, chance, uncertainty, risk, all those good things. And so some aspect of the science that you're going to talk about today, I feel like I understand at least a little bit. Seminal IPCC and national climate assessment reports, as have been mentioned, as well as many natural and social sciences studies, have described the climate-related risks to our natural and human systems. In many cases, these risks are described in quantitative terms. They provide estimates of how likely a given climate threat is to occur. And therefore, we're acutely aware of how risky climate change is and the expansive nature of the disciplines that are needed to address the challenges that climate change presents. As a model for cross-disciplinary collaboration, the Rutgers Climate Institute has more than 100 faculty affiliates across 13 schools at our university. The affiliates represent the natural sciences, the social sciences, and humanities, as well as law, medicine, business, and engineering. The Institute's mission is to facilitate these interdisciplinary connections, the associated scholarship, education, and outreach on the subject of climate change. Rutgers has been hosting an annual climate symposium since 2006, as Bob mentioned. Over the past 5 years, the event has expanded into a region-wide event that invites scholars and students from institutions throughout the Northeast. Our goal is to share knowledge, to foster collaboration among researchers and students interested in climate change. All of us at Rutgers join me in welcoming those of you who have come from afar, faculty and students alike, from diverse disciplines, and who represent, by our count, 20 institutions of higher education from Connecticut all the way down to the District of Columbia. I understand that this includes a group of 7 undergraduates from Morgan State University who drove up very early this morning from Baltimore with their faculty mentor and Rutgers PhD alum, Mark Barnes. I wonder if they could just raise their hands, and here they are, so welcome everybody. Today's symposium brings together a diverse and highly esteemed group of scholars who are also known as thought leaders. They'll probe into the issues around the Green New Deal. And I want once again to welcome you all and to thank all of our distinguished speakers and presenters whom I'm virtually certain will have at least a 99% probability of expanding our collective knowledge and fostering opportunities to work together on this important issue. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Robin and say enjoy a great day.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for now. Actually, we're going to really get going. But before we commence, I just want to acknowledge the late Frank Spasato. He was an economics major and a member of the Rutgers College graduating class of 1973. And he left a generous endowment to the Climate Institute, which underwrites the symposium today. I'd also like to recognize some of our organizers of the symposium, including Professor Simi Payne. I saw Simi somewhere. She's not raising her. All right, she's not jumping up. And of course, Marjorie Kaplan, our Associate Director of the Climate Institute, and who really did all the work. And then our keynote speaker, Naomi Klein, was also one of the organizers of today's event. So turning to our program, we have a wonderful lineup of speakers today. They're going to help us understand the Green New Deal in sort of all its dimensionality, including thinking back to the old New Deal, thinking about the blue part of the Green New Deal, thinking about social justice issues, and also kind of thinking about the climate science that underlies the justification for this process. Our keynote speaker is Naomi Klein. Naomi holds the inaugural Gloria Steinem Chair for Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies here at Rutgers. She's, as we all know, she's an award-winning journalist, a syndicated columnist, and author of a number of best-selling books. Some of the titles include No Is Not Enough, that was a book from 2017, This Changes Everything, The Shock Doctrine, No Logo, and what she'll be talking about today is her new book, On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal. So I'm happy to welcome Naomi.
Wow, thank you so much, Robin and Marjorie and everybody else who worked to bring this wonderful event together. I'm not really one of the organizers. I really didn't do any work except to suggest some people who I desperately wanted to be in conversation with and listen to, and lo and behold, they are here. I could not be more excited about the panel that's going to follow my presentation. These are some of the thinkers who've most influenced my work and are really at the center, in some cases, of really turning the idea behind a Green New Deal into actual lived reality. So before I dig into my presentation, I want to show a little film, which I hope will ground us in the big picture vision of what we're talking about here. I suspect that some of you have already seen this on a little screen, but it's kind of fun to see it on a big screen. This is a film that, comes out of a conversation that I had with a wonderful artist named Molly Crabapple, who did all of the wonderful art in this little video, where we were talking about, very early on in the process of this Green New Deal year that we've been in. It was just a couple of weeks after that resolution was introduced. And we were thinking about the original New Deal. And one of the things that, and Neil Mara is going to be talking about a piece of that history of the original New Deal as it relates to the natural environment. But one of the things that I've always been inspired about with relation to that chapter in history has to do with the absolutely central role of art and artists in the original New Deal. More than 1 million artists were paid by the government to create this renaissance in public art. Hundreds of thousands of works of art were created, murals, plays, paintings, films, and these works of art, and this was actually a part of the original New Deal in the 1930s, that was most diverse, because we know that many people were left out of the programs of the original New Deal. Women, African-American workers, immigrant workers were discriminated against and actively left out of central programs in the New Deal. The arts programs were not perfect, none of this was, but they actually represent some of the most significant funding for African-American artists, also for indigenous artists in the history of this country. So Molly and I started talking about how do we get artists involved in the New Deal, in the Green New Deal project. And one of the things that we know from history is that the central role of artists was twofold. One was recognizing artists as laborers, as workers who had a right to get paid for their work like any other worker in the economy. But also, I think that FDR was a little bit sneaky about this in understanding that he was up against a lot of forces, powerful forces that opposed the original New Deal. And a lot of them had columns in newspapers like the New York Times, and they were all thought the thing was too bold and too ambitious. And so part of what artists did was communicate around the naysayers of the original New Deal. And so that was the idea behind this little film that you're about to see. And one of the things that Molly and I talked about was that what we are up against is not just naysaying, but really a failure of imagination, that we are talking about this very bold transformation at the tail end of an economic and political project known in shorthand as the neoliberal project, which told us that there was no alternative to the economic model that we have now, in Margaret Thatcher's infamous words. And so if we are going to change in the way that scientists are telling us we need to change, we are going to need to break through that those constraints on our collective imagination that tell us that the model that we currently have is the only one we can ever have. So this is the short film.
The bullet train from New York to DC. It always brings me back to when I first started making this commute. In 2019, I was a freshman in the most diverse Congress in history. Up to that point, it was a critical time. I'll never forget the children in our community. They were so inspired to see this new class of politicians who reflected them, navigating the halls of power. It's often said, you can't be what you can't see. And for the first time, they saw themselves. I think there was something similar with the Green New Deal. We knew that we needed to save the planet and that we had all the technology to do it, but people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with how we got here. 1977, New York. A senior scientist named James Black made a presentation about how burning fossil fuels could eventually lead to global temperatures rising 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 2 years, one of the world's biggest supertankers was outfitted with a state-of-the-art lab to measure CO2 in the ocean, gathering more data about global warming. Guess who was doing all of this research? ExxonMobil, the oil and gas company. Oh yeah, Exxon knew this whole time, as did our politicians. 10 years later, James Hansen, NASA's top climate scientist, told Congress he was 99% certain that global warming was happening and caused by humans. That was 1988, the year before I was even born. So did Exxon listen to the science, including their own? Did they change business models, invest in renewables? No, the opposite. They knew and they doubled down. They and others spent millions setting up a network of lobby groups and think tanks to create doubt and denial about climate change. It was an effort designed to attack and dispute the very kind of science they themselves had been doing. And it worked. Politicians went to bat for fossil fuels, and these massive corporations kept digging and mining, drilling and fracking like there was no tomorrow. America became the biggest producer and consumer of oil in the world. Fossil fuel companies made hundreds of billions, while the public paid the lion's share to clean up their disasters. We lost a generation of time we'll never get back. Entire species will never get back. Natural wonders gone forever. And in 2017, Hurricane Maria destroyed the place where my family was from, Puerto Rico. It was like a climate bomb. It took as many American lives as 9/11. And in the next year, when I was elected to Congress, the world's leading climate scientists declared another emergency. They told us that we had 12 years left to cut our emissions in half, or hundreds of millions of people would be more likely to face food and water shortages, poverty, and death. 12 years to change everything. How we got around, how we fed ourselves, how we made our stuff, how we lived and worked, everything. The only way to do it was to transform our economy, which we already knew was broken, since the vast majority of wealth was going to just a small handful of people, and most folks were falling further and further behind. It was a true turning point. Lots of people gave up. They said we were doomed. But some of us remembered that as a nation, we'd been in peril before. The Great Depression, World War II. We knew from our history how to pull together to overcome impossible odds. And at the very least, we owed it to our children to try. The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing-for-the-fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the federal jobs guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, the biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends were in her union, including some oil workers in transition. They took apart old pipelines and got to work planting mangroves with the same salary and benefits. Of course, when it came to healing the land, we had huge gaps in our knowledge. Luckily, indigenous communities offered generational expertise to help guide the way. Ileana got restless, tried her hand as a solar plant engineer for a while, but eventually made her career in raising the next generation as part of the Universal Child Care Initiative. As it turns out, caring for others is valuable, low-carbon work, and we started paying real money to folks like teachers, domestic workers, and home health aides. Those were years of massive change, and not all of it was good. When Hurricane Sheldon hit southern Florida, parts of Miami went underwater for the last time. But as we battled the floods, fires, and droughts, we knew how lucky we were to have started acting when we did. And we didn't just change the infrastructure, we changed how we did things. We became a society that was not only modern and wealthy, but dignified and humane too. By committing to universal rights like healthcare and meaningful work for all, we stopped being so scared of the future. We stopped being scared of each other, and we found our shared purpose. Ileana heard the call too, and in 2028, she ran for office in the first cycle of publicly funded election campaigns. And now she occupies the seat that I once held. I couldn't be more proud of her, a true child of the Green New Deal. When I think back to my first term in Congress, riding that old school Amtrak in 2019, all of this was still ahead of us. And the first big step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see.
That film was a pretty broad strokes picture of what a Green New Deal could be. And lest the urgency of that vision feel untethered from reality, I want to now bring us crashing down to earth, to a part of this country where none of these issues are far away or abstract at all. I want to take you to Paradise, California. Paradise was the site of the deadliest wildfire in California's history, almost exactly 1 year ago. This fire, known as the Camp Fire, ripped through the town of Paradise, destroyed around 19,000 structures, basically the whole town, and killed 86 people. So when I was on tour with On Fire, I visited Paradise when I was in Northern California, and I was shown around by a man named Mark Stemmen, who is a professor of geography and planning at Chico State University, which is about 10 minutes away from Paradise. And along with his colleagues at Chico State, Mark Stemmen has been spending the past year researching the causes of that fire and also the aftermath, the way it is playing out in people's lives, tracking where people have gone, and also looking at the various responses and policies. So when we were in Paradise, we saw neighborhoods that look like this. And it's very, very eerie, because what you can see is that most of the debris has been cleared away now, and the plots are covered in mulch. And when you're looking at it, what it looks most like is a really well-kept campground, right? Because you have the spaces to park next to the plot, and then you've got the place where you might put up a tent. But of course, it is not a campground. This used to be a town. And there are a couple of plots where the debris has not been cleared away. And these are plots where the owner, for a variety of reasons, is in some kind of a conflict with the county. It might be over money, it might be over insurance, it might be over what it would take to remediate the land. And so for whatever reason, the county will not clear it for rebuilding. And so you have these patches where you still see the ash, the stray bricks, the weeds, the twisted metal. In some cases, you see charred patio furniture. Some of them you see like these very strange sites, like just like in a single metal staircase, which is the only surviving structure. In a lot of cases, and I'm sure you've seen this, you see a single fireplace. And so this is actually Mark Stemmen, the professor that I mentioned, standing in front of one of these lonely fireplaces, and you still have the fire implements hanging by the fire because metal survived. So I want to talk about what happened just seconds after we snapped this picture. So we are on someone's land. We weren't really thinking about that. We were just taking these pictures and documenting it. But just a couple seconds after this picture, a car pulled up, and the person got out, and he was irate. And he's screaming at us, "Get off my property." And he is understandably enraged by what has become this endless procession of kind of disaster tourists coming to Paradise. We've had, it's become a backdrop for all kinds of things. And he was angry about this. And as we talked to him, and Mark, who knows a lot about the situation, was kind of trying to calm him down and find out what was going on, we discovered that it wasn't just the disaster tourism that was making this man so angry, so enraged. He was also talking about the insurance companies that wouldn't pay up. He was also talking about the county that wouldn't let him clean up. He was also talking about the fact that the state was telling him he needed to seal up his well because the water was now contaminated. He was talking about the absence of decent housing for people who had been displaced. He was talking about, as pretty much everybody in California does, PG&E, the much loathed private electricity company, energy company, which actually caused the fire and has done so little to face their responsibility for this. So all of these forces had combined to kind of twist the knife for the person who owned this piece of land. He already was facing the loss of all of his belongings. He was already dealing with the trauma of surviving this fire, but all of these forces were layered on top of it, just making it all that much worse. So I really wanted to properly introduce myself to him, to apologize for our trespass. And as I got closer to him, I had this feeling of just how volatile the situation was. And I've spent 15 years since I was researching the shock doctrine, probably more than 15 years now, in shocked places, places that have been bombed, places that have suffered, really horrific events, including natural disasters. And I know from experience how volatile, emotionally volatile these situations are, and how quickly the gale force of emotions that are stirred up in these moments can direct themselves at the closest available target. So we quickly left, we apologized, but this encounter was, for me, a really important reminder of the kind of complex challenges that climate disruption places, gives communities to deal with. And that has a lot to do with what I think why a lot of us are focused on this Green New Deal framework, an approach to the climate crisis that is truly intersectional, that is about lowering emissions in line with what scientists are telling us we need to do, but doing it in a way that redresses multiple injustices at the same time. And that is the sort of vision and thinking behind a Green New Deal. Now, the climate crisis is global, as you all know. But I'm choosing to focus my remarks today on this small pocket in Northern California because I think that the people who live there are really quite interesting because they absolutely did their best to respond to this crisis in a way that held on to their humanity. But they found themselves, like that individual who we met, trapped in this web of forces that were just making the crisis so much more stressful, so much more difficult than it needed to be. And it was kind of undermining their best impulses, at least this is what I found, at every turn. And I think that the experience of this one community, or actually two communities, of Paradise and Chico down the road, illustrates in very real terms why it is so urgent that we take this holistic approach to the climate crisis. So, back to Paradise. When thousands of people got into their cars and fled those flames that had engulfed their town, they all went on this one road. There's really one road out of town. It is called the Skyway. And so people were bumper to bumper on the Skyway. And at certain points, there were flames on both sides, really just an absolute worst nightmare. And what many people said is they didn't feel safe from the fire until they reached the outskirts of Chico. As I said, it's normally a 10-minute drive, but in this situation, it took much, much longer because the entire town is evacuating. And they said that they didn't feel safe until they got to the outskirts of Chico. And the reason for that is sort of interesting from a planning perspective. I'm not sure what the implications of this are, but the big box retailers around Chico are all surrounded, as they are, in every community, by these huge parking lots, these huge asphalt parking lots. And the asphalt acted as a natural fire break, okay? So a whole lot of people evacuating from Paradise pulled into the parking lot of Walmart, and that was where they finally said that they felt safe. And so what happened in the parking lot of Walmart on the outskirts of Chico is really quite interesting, because there they were met by volunteers from a really remarkable organization called North Valley Mutual Aid, which is an anarchist cooperative, has a lot of involvement now from the DSA, from the Democratic Socialists of America, and they self-organized immediately in response to the fire, assuming that there wasn't going to be a functional response, which is something that we have learned, I think people here remember Sandy, and maybe some of you remember Occupy Sandy, which was a similar mutual aid-based, grassroots response to just going out and giving people what they need. So that's what people did in the aftermath of this fire. Immediately afterwards, so all the people who ended up in the parking lot of Walmart were greeted by volunteers who had clothing, who had pollution masks, who had hot meals, who had dog food for pets, and much more. And so this is what it started to look like. This is the kind of an anti-Walmart, if you will. Everything is free. And there was a whiteboard where, at this point, people didn't know where their friends were. They didn't know where their family members were. And so any information about people still missing, have you seen this person, have you heard anything from this person, was up on the whiteboard. Portable toilets appeared and showers a few days later. Walmart donated some supplies, and they also made a killing selling tents and sleeping bags and whatever else anyone needed. And so there's this empty field right next to the Walmart. So you can see in the background there the Walmart sign, and there is this tent city. And it is became a place for people recently made homeless by the fire to stay with their community, to stay connected with each other. And it was also a place for Chico's residents to show up with donations and offers of spare bedrooms. And it looks grim, but the word that I heard many people in Chico use to describe what was happening in the parking lot of Walmart was beautiful. That this was actually kind of amazing, the way their community had come together and really found their best selves. And this is something that those of us who have studied disasters know, is that when we are tested by crisis, we often see the most extraordinary things that people are capable of. And this was certainly true during the fire itself. Nurses, doctors, elder care workers went to these heroic lengths to save the lives of the people in their care. People are very proud of the fact that nobody in Paradise who was in collective care, right, died in the fires, that their care workers saved them. Those 86 people were people who were left alone in their homes, right? So it was really isolation that took those lives in Paradise. Chico's residents also knew that what had happened to their neighbors in Paradise could easily have happened to them, and indeed could happen to them at any time. that they are not safe from the impacts of this ongoing drought, these very, very powerful winds, and so on. And so they found their best selves. They shared what they had, they opened their homes to strangers, they asked people what they needed, and they made it happen. There were all kinds of other examples of this, like the sports teams from Chico State University. And this is something I think Rutgers students would be able to relate to. The sports teams would go to all the different evacuation centers and just do pickup games with kids, you know, because, and just spontaneously do activities with them. And the other thing was that there was this real strong rejection of any kind of profiteering. If there was a whiff of profiteering, you know, prices being hiked, people were just outraged by it. So Mark Stemmen, that Chico State, a professor, he put it to me like this. He said, a tsunami of fear and terror rolled down the hill from Paradise, but that tsunami was buffeted by a blanket of love and comfort. So we know that this is not always how humans respond to disasters, and California has given us some counter examples of this, particularly when we have seen really powerful wildfires descend on very wealthy areas. In the LA area in particular, ultra-rich mansion owners protecting themselves with private firefighters, for instance. These are some private firefighting trucks. These are concierge services if you have enough money. Your house and your house alone can be protected while your neighbors' houses burn. We also saw, I think maybe some of you heard those stories, those really awful stories from the recent wildfires in LA, where wealthy areas were evacuated, but the owners of those mansions failed to tell their housekeepers and gardeners not to come to work, and they were so afraid of being fired that they showed up anyway. There's also the fact that hundreds of the people doing the most dangerous work in California fighting fires are prison inmates being paid $1 an hour to do this labor. We've also seen examples, and this is also happening in Northern California, where migrant farm workers have been forced to work under terribly unsafe conditions, and some of them have collapsed on the job and then are deported for their efforts, like defective goods. And then, of course, there's PG&E itself, which during the last round of fires in California, where they cut off power to, at one point, 2 million homes, started selling generators on their website to deal with the problem that they themselves had created. So I'm not going to go on too much about disaster capitalism. If you're interested in it, I wrote a book about it. Humans are capable of awful things in the midst of crisis. Okay, I think we know this. But the thing about Chico, and this is what really I find so heartbreaking about this example, is that they tried so hard to provide a counterpoint to all of this, to really embody these principles of solidarity and mutual aid that we need in the rocky future that we face. But here is the trouble. We do not currently live in a society that is governed by the idea that people have a right to housing, have a right to food, have a right to health care. On the contrary, we have an economic system that is governed around these principles of competition and scarcity, and that puts a very high price on the things that people need to survive. And so while there may be a short window where different values enter in after disasters, the full implications of that descend very, very quickly, as they did in Chico. And so one of the things to understand about Chico is that it is not a big city. It is a scrappy college town of around 100,000 people. And so what happened after the Paradise fires is that they suddenly had 20,000 new neighbors, okay, 20,000 new people entering a community of 100,000 overnight. That is a very, very big population shift. And well before the Camp Fire, Chico had a serious shortage of affordable housing, which is actually why a lot of people who work in Chico lived in Paradise, because it was cheaper. You could get a cheaper home. And a lot of people couldn't afford that and were sleeping on the streets of Chico. They had a pretty serious homelessness problem. And so after the fire, when free food and supplies started being distributed outside Walmart, members of Chico's chronically homeless population understandably showed up, interested in the food and the other aid. alongside the people who had just become homeless. Now, North Valley Mutual Aid was very clear that they don't believe that there is a hierarchy of deserving and undeserving homeless, that everybody deserves care. And interestingly, many of the evacuees from Paradise talked about how they actually appreciated that they were camping alongside people who had years of experience with homelessness because they learned some important skills like how to keep their belongings safe, how to line their tents with cardboard to keep themselves dry and things like that. But some residents of Chico did not feel that way. And they portrayed the pre-fire homeless as invaders, as interlopers, as freeloaders, and this hierarchy of deserving and undeserving homeless emerged. Meanwhile, Black Friday was approaching, as it is now, and the promise of blockbuster sales for Walmart made the company very anxious to clear the parking lot of all of these people. So they faced a lot of pushback from this, and Walmart's compromise was, we will donate a sum of money for a homelessness shelter in Chico, not in our parking lot. And so they actually, a place was found, but there was a community backlash. They were worried about property values and all of the usual things that pushes against that. And so in the end, people were evicted and no homelessness shelter was created. It didn't help that despite that early resistance to profiteering, there was actually no stopping disaster capitalism in Chico. So rents shot up along with home prices, and improbably, Realtor.com ranked Chico as the hottest housing market in the United States, okay? And this is like in California, right, where Silicon Valley is. Little Chico, scrappy little Chico is the hottest housing market. That's how scarce housing was. And evictions started soaring. And this created another kind of homelessness. The way Mark Stemmen described it to me is that now people were evicted not by fire, but by greed. Not surprisingly, all of this had an impact on that initial wave of human solidarity. After all, it's harder to feel good about opening your home to strangers when you keep hearing stories about the guy down the street who made a killing flipping his house thanks to post-disaster price inflation, or the people buying up property in smoldering Paradise at bargain basement prices, or, and this is something I saw firsthand, the fact that a luxury developer was using the crisis to push through the permitting for a gated community on the outskirts of Paradise, avoiding the usual regulations and debate. And actually the infrastructure for this private gated community was built by FEMA because it was their ground zero of their disaster response. So he had all of the infrastructure, the water, the sewage, built at taxpayer expense, and now the plan was to turn it into a gated community. This can put people in a bad mood, right? So making matters worse was an epidemic of the kind of PTSD that we witnessed firsthand on that lot, that empty lot in Paradise. Several of the Chico State researchers that I spoke with observed that PTSD was not only rampant among residents of Paradise that had themselves survived the fire, but they said, everybody in Chico, not only do they know people in Paradise, but, and this was described to me in very graphic terms, they knew that for weeks they were breathing in ash that they knew contained human remains, right? And several people described it to me as a crematorium. People were traumatized by this, understandably so. So it shouldn't be surprising that in this context, people were having trouble living in close quarters without turning on each other. Rates of domestic violence increased quite sharply after the fire. And in addition to there being more incidents of domestic violence, the reported cases were also much more severe. The attacks were much more severe. And this is by no means unique to Chico. We saw it in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. In fact, the huge protests that eventually overthrew Governor Rosselló began with feminists camping out outside of the governor's mansion, demanding that they take action on a spate of femicide. I saw the same thing on the Gulf Coast in the aftermath of the BP disaster. And this, I think, is a kind of an ironclad rule, I would say, around disaster, climate change in general, and disaster specifically, is that whatever was bad before the disaster, whatever inequalities existed, whatever abuses existed before the disaster hit, are just going to, it's just going to increase exponentially after the disaster. Whatever was broken will be shattered. So one of the things that have happened is that artists have really stepped up to help people deal with trauma in lots of ways. This is a work that was unveiled on the 1-year anniversary, and it contains 12,000 keys of homes that were destroyed and cars that were lost, and this is, a phoenix from the flames. There's an artist who's been painting portraits of some of the people. As you can see, many of them are elderly, on the remaining structures in Paradise. And there have been these large gatherings, memorials on the anniversary. What there is not is anything close to the kind of mental health supports that would have helped people from turning on each other as a result of these overlapping pressures. So, living inside this cauldron of stress has taught many Chico residents an important lesson, that in the real world, the climate crisis cannot be pried apart from the many other social and economic crises they face, which brings us to the subject of our gathering today, which is the Green New Deal. A couple of weeks ago, just before the 1-year anniversary of the fire, local politicians in Chico unveiled a plan calling for their small city to adopt a Green New Deal for Chico. And like its national inspiration, the Chico Green New Deal framework calls for more affordable housing, a safe and sustainable food system, water security, which means resisting various attempts at water privatization, investment in clean 21st century public transit, green job creation, projects earmarked for the poorest residents, and much more. And of course, they are aware that they aren't able to do all of this on a local level, but the vice mayor of Chico told me that they wanted to show what the Green New Deal could look like locally, particularly in a place that has been on the front lines of climate breakdown. And it's one of many similar subnational Green New Deal projects that we've seen unveiled over the course of this year, catalyzed by the national efforts that began when the Sunrise Movement occupied the office of Nancy Pelosi, were visited famously by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the next is history. Maine has introduced a Green New Deal. Seattle City Council has passed a resolution unanimously supporting a Green New Deal for Seattle. And I think the Seattle case is really interesting because that resolution also committed to creating an oversight board to hold the city to its commitments, a body that will be made up of representatives from communities directly impacted by racial, economic, and environmental injustices. So 8 members of frontline communities are on that board. It also includes climate scientists, also includes labor representatives, but that part of it is very significant and quite unprecedented for politicians to say, we want you to hold us accountable in that way. So coming back to Chico, and I know I'm running low on time, I guess the reason why I wanted to talk about Chico has to do with that huge population flow, huge from their perspective, having 20,000 people coming to a community of 100,000 people. I think the truth is that we need to be honest about the fact that even if we do absolutely everything right to lower our emissions as much as we possibly can, we are facing a rocky future, right? Even at 1.5 degrees warming, certainly at 2 degrees warming. We are seeing this with 1 degree warming. We are facing a future where more and more people are going to have to live more densely on less and less land, right? And so as we think about what our response is to that, we have to figure out how we do that in a way that doesn't pit people against each other, that doesn't force people to turn on each other, in the way that a community like Chico, that tried so hard to do well by their neighbors was really unable to resist, right? And that's really remarkable because Chico is a homogenous community. It is a, it's a working class, middle class community. It's a overwhelmingly white community. It doesn't have the same racial and religious fault lines that many parts of the world are dealing with when they face these sorts of population transfers, right? We saw it in Syria, what happened when 1.5 million people were displaced by drought. It was one of the major drivers of the outbreak of civil war. So this is what I think what Chico shows. And the other thing that we are seeing and this is that because we are not only talking about our response to climate change in the context of climate disasters that are unavoidable, we are also talking about our responses in the rubble of a 50-year project that has systematically attacked the public sphere, that has created that sense of scarcity, that has shredded social safety nets, that has attacked labor protections. And so many of the so-called market-based responses to this crisis have really just been passing the bill for the crisis onto regular working people. So it means your fuel costs increase. It means your electricity costs increase. It means your public transit costs increase. And what we're seeing around the world is that people just can't take it. And so when these so-called market-based responses to climate change descend upon them, it often leads to very, very strong backlash. And this is some images from the Gilets jaunes movement, the Yellow Vest movement in France. This is what happened when France introduced a climate policy that just increased the price of petroleum for working people at the same time as they saw millionaires and billionaires getting tax breaks and so on. In Chile, the uprising that we're seeing right now was actually sparked by an increase in public transit fares that the Chilean government introduced after they had bought a fleet of electric buses, in part to prepare for the COP, in part to prepare for the fact that they were supposed to host, the next UN climate summit. So they bought the good electric buses, which we want them to do, but they increased transit fares for working people. And it didn't go over well, and now the COP was canceled, among other devastating impacts, of that sort of, I think, disastrous market-based response to the climate crisis. So, bottom line. Ever since the Green New Deal landed on the political map, it has been attacked by liberals for its supposedly impractical scope and ambition. Fighting poverty, racism, and homelessness are worthy goals, we have been told, but what do they have to do with lowering greenhouse gas emissions? Surely a carbon-centric approach, like a simple tax or cap and trade, some narrow regulation on polluters, is much more likely to succeed. And besides, connecting greenhouse gas reductions with building a fairer society just confirms Republican beliefs that climate change is a vast left-wing plot, so why be so polarizing? Chico discovered the hard way that there is no way to cope with climate breakdown without simultaneously shifting to a very different kind of economy, one that is willing to make major non-market investments in housing, transit, health, including mental health, water, electricity, and more. As you saw, Chico's residents did everything right. They tried to have each other's back. But it turns out that sustaining that empathetic impulse beyond the initial emergency phase takes more than goodwill. It takes good policy alongside serious public investments. And that's what they're trying to do at the local level, and that's what we need to do at the national and international level. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Naomi. So we have about 15 minutes now for questions. Our tradition here at all our Climate Institute events is to ask students to please ask questions first, and then we sort of follow in that order. So if you have questions, please come up to the podium. I'm sorry, not the podium, the microphone right here. I think, is there just one? Just one, yeah. So please don't be shy. Please come up, and hopefully we have a few students. I know Naomi's comments were very interesting and provocative, and I'm sure raised some questions for folks. So please come on up. Oh yes, also for the folks on live stream, you can type in questions, which Marjorie will be sort of monitoring. So please come on up, and then we're gonna go for 15 minutes, and then we'll have a break after that.
Hi, I'm a PhD student in the geography department. You mentioned PG&E, and you showed that photo of we need to own PG&E. With all the loathing going around about PG&E and all these rolling blackouts, what do you see as the future for the company, and how likely is it that they will be kind of incorporated more into the government and have restrictions on them?
Mm-hmm. I think it's fairly likely. Governor Newsom has been pretty vocal about just the fact that the current ownership structure really has not served the state of California, and so I think it's a real opportunity, to be honest, to move beyond a sort of just a private bad, public good model around this, because it isn't, I think just being in public hands is no guarantee, especially in a state like California that has such strong restrictions on just the ability to raise taxes and finance the kind of investments that PG&E has not made, right? I mean, the issue is that they've been paying shareholders and executives instead of, burying their electricity lines but it's a big cost, right? And so I don't necessarily have the faith that the state of California would do that much of a better job. There's an interesting statement that was put out by the Climate Justice Alliance that I'd encourage people to look up just a couple of days ago about the need to be looking at a different kind of grid, right? Which is a less brittle, less centralized grid that is much more around local microgrids and is really a rethink of how energy is being generated. Obviously, we need to be renewable energy, but I think the model of just having huge wind farms, for instance, and having it travel those same lines, is not going to solve the problem. That's very, very clear, right? And it's something we've seen in a lot of disaster zones. So I think we will see a different ownership structure. But I think the real debate is what the governing structure looks like and whether we're really able to change to a different kind of grid.
Hello, my name is Emily Grzowski. I'm an undergraduate at Rutgers here, and my question is, do you predict, or would you see it to be more effective first off when we start change for the Green New Deal on the local, state, or national level? I understand that all of it is important, but what do you think will kind of start to be more effective first? I think.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is. We certainly are in an all of the above moment, and there are limits to what municipalities can do in terms of raising funds and so on, and what that means is different in different states, right? I mean, New Jersey is a state where there's a relatively large amount of flexibility for municipalities to raise funds. There's certainly people like to complain a lot about property taxes here in New Jersey. But there are places where there isn't the same leverage at the local level, so that makes these public investments a lot harder. I think the reason why the local level is so important in this moment, I guess the short answer is wherever we can act right now, we have to act, right? Because we know we're not going to be acting at the federal level. We're going in the wrong direction at the federal level. So that increases the responsibility of any sphere, right? Where one can act to act. So, we're here in New Jersey. We're here at Rutgers, which is a huge institution in and of itself that could have its own Green New Deal. And by the way, Chico State is looking at what would a Green New Deal look like for Chico State. This is a university with 70,000 students with massive infrastructure, and there are some great green projects, but we can always do more. And it's also a blue state, and so so the idea that we're building new fossil fuel infrastructure in New Jersey, to me, is absolutely outrageous. The more that we create opportunities for people to feel what this looks like in their lives, the more we're going to move past the polarization, right? The more it ceases to be a theoretical, political, top-down debate about ideology, and the more it just becomes about what you want your community to look like and what you want your life to be like. And so that is something that we can do at the local level, and we have a responsibility to do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Naomi. My name is Kai Nguyen. I'm a PhD student at Rutgers. I look at how New York is adapting to climate change. I was wondering, so you were talking about how our society has have shifted away of valuing, values like affordable housing, clean water, access to clean water, clean air. So my question is, what do we ask from our public officials to do better? Do we need to reimagine the role of the state? There's a lot of push for public and private partnership. For example, New York and the construction boom, they're like, the private sector needs to help build the infrastructure. But that's where it seems where it is going. So what do we do about the role of the state? How do the public drives the role of the state? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think more than anything else, the kind of vision that we're seeing in, in this Green New Deal, broad strokes, big picture, but we're also now we're starting to get more specific, and Daniel Donna Cohen is going to be talking about this concrete, the first sort of concrete policy proposal that's now been unveiled by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is a Green New Deal for public housing, right? And I would defer a little bit to Daniel to answer this question in terms of what role the private sector may or may not play in that. Because, if you want people to use these services, they have to be affordable, right? And so public-private partnerships are, there are advantages, especially because there's been a huge de-skilling in the public sphere, right? We've hollowed out our public sphere to such an extent that the people who actually know how to build things don't work for the state. But if you want people to use public transit, the best way to do it is to improve it. You study New York, make it better and make it free. When Paris wants people to use the metro because the air pollution is so bad, and this happens, they have periodic air pollution crises in Paris, they just announced that the metro is free. And lo and behold, everybody takes the metro, right? So we are, I personally don't see what the market incentives are if you want to encourage that kind of dense, low-carbon living, and in some key sectors, like transit, right? And also public housing, affordable housing, because again and again, what we've seen go wrong in urban settings is you have these big green investments in transit and in green space, but you don't deal with the housing piece, and so housing prices soar, low-income people get pushed out of the cities. They're the ones who use transit. They can't use transit because they get pushed out to exurbs that aren't connected to transit, and the people who can afford to live in these little green bubbles actually drive anyway, right? So gentrification is a huge problem in the way we've tended to design so-called green infrastructure.
Hi, my name's Nathan. I'm a political science major. And I was just thinking about what you said with regards to global instability being fueled by climate change. And I was wondering, what should the United States' attitude be toward different regimes around the world, even or especially regimes that we find hostile to us regarding how they deal with the climate crisis? So with the protests in Chile...
We're not in the strongest position at the moment.
I know. I know.
They call me a dreamer.
No, but I'm saying, even given our weakened position, what, with regards to the protests going on in Bolivia, Chile, Iran, especially Iran because they're a regional enemy, what should our attitude be towards helping them deal with the worst effects of climate change? Should it be reconciliatory, or should it be a defensive crouch, I guess you could say?
Well, okay, so there's a lot of variables in that question, and I think that with the government we currently have, there is absolutely no leverage to ask anything of any other country when it comes to climate change, because Trump is an arsonist when it comes to climate change, and he is making alliances, active alliances, with other arsonists around the world, whether it's Bolsonaro, or Modi, and there's a formula, and I talk about this in the book, right? That I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing the rise of a certain kind of a strong man political figure in a moment when the climate crisis is intersecting so forcefully with the legacy of neoliberal economic policies and creating a very, very flammable context where it is possible to turn populations against each other in the way that we see Modi doing now with the Muslim population, and the way that we see Trump doing with casting immigrants as invaders and so on. I mean, what I can say is what I believe a U.S. government should be doing internationally is, first of all, we should be rapidly decarbonizing our own economy in line with science and justice, right? And so justice is not something that stops at our border. Justice also means paying the debts that we owe internationally and acknowledging that the U.S. is the world's largest historical emitter. And we have gotten rich in large part based on extracting resources around the world, and we have to help pay for the transition around the world. So, some of the candidates I think are grasping this better than others, and it's one of the things that one of the reasons why I've been highlighting Bernie Sanders' climate plan is because he's talking about putting $200 billion into the UN Climate Fund, which the U.S. has an obligation to live up to those responsibilities. The U.S. is a signatory, not just to the Paris Accord, which he's backed out of, but to the UN Climate Convention, which says that we have common but differentiated responsibilities. And so the idea that the U.S. can lead just by itself decarbonizing is a non-starter in 2019, right? The U.S., there has to be a twofold strategy of, yes, we rapidly decarbonize, but by living up to our responsibilities internationally, that's how we catalyze other countries to do what they need to do as well, which is leapfrog directly to renewable energy and also leave their forests intact and so on, and not dig up the fossil fuels beneath in order to alleviate poverty. I mean, that's the argument. We're going to dig up the oil and gas and coal to deal with poverty in our countries, and it's our turn to pollute now, right? And the only way we undercut that argument is actually by living up to our responsibilities. Jair Bolsonaro says, we have a right to burn down the Amazon, and anybody who tells us that we don't is an imperialist, right? I mean, he is weaponizing a sort of anti-colonial discourse that only works because countries like the United States haven't lived up to their international responsibilities. If we do that, we undercut that argument and we strengthen the social movements in all of these countries who are trying to protect their forests, are trying to clean the air, in cities like Delhi, and Beijing, and that's, I think, how we have a catalytic international impact, because we can't save a habitable climate just in one country. That's the nature of the crisis we face.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Raphael. My question is just going back to the fire, actually. I was just wondering how social media was used, and in trauma, like in these periods of trauma, were people just like going through their Instagram, looking at family pictures, because to deal with it, or just to cut off from their emotions, or were they sort of using it strategically to share photos of, I mean, I'm sure every person used it millions of ways at every time. I was just wondering if you can expand upon how the social media was used to kind of to kind of heal people or to divide people in that particular moment.
I don't know of any cases in the Camp Fire, the fire that burned down Paradise, specifically around social media being used to divide people. I do know of cases where, in Puerto Rico after Maria, there was no social media because the communication networks went down along with the electricity. And so people were communicating face to face and leaving their houses and finding out what was going on with their neighbors. And so, it's one of the things that you realize really quickly in the aftermath of these disasters. I mean, they often do knock out communication networks and they do knock out internet, and you realize how dependent we've become. And we really need backup communication networks and that assume that we can't assume that we will be able to stay connected in the aftermath of disasters. But I don't know specifically about what you're asking in terms of
It
Chico.
was
Yeah.
kind of a vague question.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think we're going to go ahead and take a break now. We'll be back. We need to be back and reconvene right at 10:45 sharp, so we have about a little less than 25 minutes for break. Okay? Thank you. Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you.
Excellent job. It was wonderful. Okay, well, welcome back to the second half of our symposium. This morning, we're going to hear from 4 distinguished panelists on our plenary panel. 3 of our panelists are here in person. They include Neil Marr of the New Jersey Institute of Technology, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson of Ocean Collective, and Daniel Adana Cohn of the University of Pennsylvania. Barring any glitches, we're also going to be hearing from Dr. Marshall Shepard of the University of Georgia, who's going to be joining us remotely as our 4th panelist. So we have biographies of all the panelists in the materials that you've sort of received already, but they're also on, for those online, they're on our symposium website. So there's longer bios, but I'll just make a couple comments about each of our speakers. Dr. Marr received his PhD in history from New York University, and he is a professor in the Department of History at New Jersey Institute of Technology. I just want to highlight that his 2009 book, entitled Nature's New Deal, The Civilian Conservation Corps and the Roots of the American Environmental Movement, received the Charles A. Weyerhaeuser Award for the best monograph in conservation history. I bought the book. It's wonderful. I definitely recommend it. Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson is a marine biologist, policy expert, and conservation strategist. She earned her PhD from Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and she's the founder and CEO of Ocean Collective. Daniel Adana Cohn is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and he directs the Socio-Spatial Climate Collaborative, or SC Squared. He's also a member of the Advanced Institute, the Institute for Advanced Study at a small university down the road called Princeton. And finally, Marshall Shepard is a leading international expert on weather and climate and is also the Georgia Athletic Association Distinguished Professor of Geography and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Georgia. Those of you who may have seen Dr. Shepard on the Weather Channel. He has a Sunday talk show there, and he's also a regular contributor to Forbes. So we will, I guess, start with Neil. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you to Marjorie Kaplan and Robin Lachenko for inviting me to the symposium. I guess I should also thank Naomi if she was involved in getting my name out there. I appreciate that as well. I want to thank my fellow panelists, Naomi, Daniel Cohen, Ayanna Johnson, and Marshall Shepard, for having an incredible conversation before the symposium to prepare, but also I know we're going to have a great conversation after we all give our individual talks. So thank you for that. But most of all, I want to thank all of you for coming and hearing us talk about probably the most pressing issue of our time. So thank you for making the effort. What I want to do today is I want to give us a brief history lesson on the original New Deal, so we're all on the same page and we have a foundation for the rest of our discussion. I want to then discuss the successes and limitations of that original New Deal, because I think it really will inform the way we think about the Green New Deal policies that are coming our way now. And then in the end, I just want to describe what I think the original New Deal has to offer for the Green New Deal. If I can figure this out. Oh, it's up there, sorry. So when we think back on our history lessons, the textbooks we probably were forced to read in high school, we think about or are taught that the New Deal, the original New Deal, was a political response to an economic crisis. It began on October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. $30 billion evaporated on the market in one day, 25% unemployment, over 5,000 banks went belly up like this one here in New York City. creating images like this, a bread line in New York City where people lined up to get a loaf of bread so they could make it through the week. This was happening in cities all across the country, and we also learn in those textbooks that the New Deal was a political solution to this economic crisis, and we were forced to memorize all those New Deal agencies, those alphabet agencies. It became mind-numbing, right? The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, which put unemployed Americans to work building public roads. Here we see a crew building a road near Pittsburgh. Not to be confused with the Public Works Administration, the PWA. I just confuse them, and I study this stuff. That put unemployed Americans to work building public buildings like schools, libraries, and this post office in Eugene, Oregon. And also the Federal Arts Program, which Naomi mentioned earlier. They had a federal theater project, a federal writers project, and a federal arts project that put unemployed artists to work making art for public spaces. This is a mural in a post office in Thayer County, Nebraska. So we're taught that the New Deal is a political response to an economic crisis, but if we look back and actually listen to Franklin Roosevelt, we'll realize that there was a second crisis that he was concerned with back in the 1930s that we don't hear much about, and it's a crisis that's very relevant to the crisis we're facing today. So I want to take a quick look at a fireside chat, a quick listen to a fireside chat that he made in 1933 in the very early days of his presidency. Just a really quick clip so we can try to understand that crisis. This is a fireside chat where he introduces a New Deal program called the Civilian Conservation Corps. I think. They told me that I would look over there and it would start, but I don't know when. If you go to the bottom of the image, nope. If you go to the bottom of the image, there should be a little arrow you can click on. Let me help. In this fireside chat, Franklin Roosevelt introduces this new program, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And this is the quote that is the most important and really is what matters here. It would have been good to hear his voice, but it's okay. He argues that in creating the Civilian Conservation Corps and other New Deal programs like it, he says, we are killing two birds with one stone. We are clearly enhancing the value of our natural resources by doing all this conservation work on the one hand, and we are relieving an appreciable amount of actual distress, and by that he means economic distress. So what he's saying here is that there's not only an economic crisis, there's also an environmental crisis that we are facing in the 1930s, and we can create programs, certain types of New Deal programs, that can solve both problems simultaneously. And it turns out that conservation becomes central to the New Deal. The Soil Conservation Service is created very, very early on in the New Deal period that educated farmers and helped them transform their farms in ways that conserve soil and water. This is a farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania that has been reorganized with contour plowing to help those farmers there. The Tennessee Valley Authority, creating dams to produce electricity, but also to conserve water for electricity, but also irrigation, farming irrigation. This is the Norris Dam in Tennessee. And then finally, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which Roosevelt was chatting about in his fireside chat, which is best remembered for planting trees. And I just want to mention that this image here was produced by an artist from the Federal Arts Program about the CCC, and that's the image I used for my book. So the takeaway here is that the old New Deal was already green. It was already green, and we should remember that when we start thinking about this new Green New Deal. We need to remember this, and we also need to think about it as we start to process the new proposals. And in the rest of my talk, I want to discuss the successes and the failures of the old New Deal, both the economic successes and failures and the environmental successes and failures, so that we can move on to a discussion about how those successes and failures might affect our thinking of the new proposals today. The environmental successes are pretty easy to tick off. 2.3 billion trees planted between 1933 and 1942. Half the trees planted in US history, 12 trees planted for every American during the Great Depression. 40 million acres of soil conserved all over the country, from California to Maine to Florida to Oregon. Over 1,000 parks created, 800 state parks created from scratch, a couple hundred created in urban areas, and also all of our national parks were being developed for tourism. Total land affected larger than the state of California. This is a grand project, a huge infusion of capital that transformed the American landscape in ways that affect us every single day. The economic successes are also fairly straightforward. The New Deal conservation programs put millions and millions of people to work, working class people. It gave them jobs. The Civilian Conservation Corps alone put over 3 million young men to work during this decade of economic crisis. It also helped local communities. Farmers that participated with the Soil Conservation Service increased their agricultural production, which helped those farming communities. And other communities that were located near conservation projects undertaken by, for instance, the CCC or the TVA, also benefited from an infusion of capital from Washington, D.C., through these work programs into the local communities. This is Bear Mountain State Park, just up the Hudson River from here. There were 11 camps in that park. These are the communities around that park. On average, they each experienced a $5,000 per month infusion of capital from the federal program down through these camps into the local communities. And then finally, economically, it was, it could be argued it was somewhat successful as well on a global scale. During the Great Depression and also during the war and after the war, foreign countries petitioned for help in establishing their own New Deal conservation programs. This is a map of TVA aid and TVA specialization and knowledge that went out across the world to allow other countries to create TVA-like programs. And there are a lot of problems with the TVA that we can get to. But the Soil Conservation Service also initiated soil conservation programs all throughout Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa as well. So it's important to remember these successes, but I think it's even more important to remember the failures and the blunders of New Deal conservation as well, because we can learn from those mistakes. So let's talk about these environmental failures pretty quickly. Invasive species. Much of the soil conservation work was done by the introduction of invasives. The most important case is kudzu, a Japanese species that was introduced all throughout the South that led to scenes like this, sort of kudzu overtaking the entire landscape of the South. Decrease in biodiversity. A lot of the reforestation programs planted single species in straight rows, which not only decreases biodiversity, but also leads to an increased susceptibility to disease, another ecological blunder. We see this crop row here. And then finally, drainage work, draining swamps for mosquito control, completely degraded dozens of, if not hundreds of ecosystems all over the country, ecosystems that are extremely important for not only biodiversity, but climate change as well. Now, many of these ecological mistakes can be forgiven, I think, because the science of ecology during this period was extremely young and in its infancy. But the social and economic blunders, I think, are less able to be forgiven, and I want to run through those quickly now before I wrap up. Most obviously, women were not involved and not enrolled in these conservation efforts. Eleanor Roosevelt, for instance, lobbied Franklin Roosevelt to allow women to join the CCC, and he said no. There was one camp in the country for women. It was called Camp Terra in that Bear Mountain State Park that we saw. And this is a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt actually addressing those female enrollees. And it's interesting to note that they were not taught conservation work, they were taught domestic skills like canning, housework, and taking care of their children. So gender discrimination first. Another failure, racial exclusion. The CCC camps were segregated. African Americans had their own camps. And within those camps, it was extremely difficult for African American enrollees to move up the administrative ladder. It was nearly impossible. Most of those African American camps were led by white administrators. And then finally, Native Americans. There was a separate program run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs for New Deal conservation programs involving Native Americans. Here we see some Navajo members of a CCC group that were doing work in Chaco National Monument to make it more conducive and better for tourists. Many of these tourists were not from the area, they were wealthier and they were white. So in a sense, they were engaging these Native Americans to change landscapes in ways that further distanced their access to those landscapes and in a sense, created a new type of colonization that was going on in these regions. So to wrap this up, I just want to argue that we must use this past and apply it to the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal can give millions of working class Americans green jobs, as the original New Deal did. It should involve thousands of local communities in such efforts, as the original New Deal did. And it needs to promote such efforts globally, as the original New Deal did, because as we all know, climate change is our global problem. But the Green New Deal must also avoid the mistakes of the original New Deal. It must ensure that these green jobs don't have unintended environmental consequences, or at least that we limit them. And that means listening and funding science. We have to study the environmental consequences of, for instance, constructing green infrastructure, investing in green manufacturing, and producing green technologies. Second, we must ensure that the millions getting these green jobs include everyone. Access to programs must not only be open to all, but we need to encourage participation by minorities and working class people, poor people, because they are the ones who are going to be most affected by climate change. And then finally, we need to promote the Green New Deal not simply as a diplomatic export from Washington, D.C., as the original New Deal was, but rather we need to expand such efforts through international partnerships and in cooperation with global environmental initiatives. We cannot put America first in such efforts. Learning from the past in these ways will make today's Green New Deal not only environmentally sound in our fight against climate change, but as important, economically and socially just. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So our next panelist is Ayanna Johnson.
Hello. Does this work? Oh, great. I don't have any notes, so I don't need a podium. I thought I would just hang out here and chat with you. So my name's Ayanna. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you for being here, and to the brave souls on the other end of the live stream as well. I'm a marine biologist by training, and so I think a lot about ocean conservation, but also how that intersects with social justice in this context of a Green New Deal, which I will argue needs to be more blue. So the way that I think about ocean conservation is that it's about people, and more specifically, it's about marginalized people, because if we think about who's in areas that are overfished or polluted, or who even has access to ocean resources anymore, there's a very clear racial and socioeconomic divide along those lines of who gets access to resources, who gets shut out, and who has to deal with various toxins. So, but more generally, when I say ocean conservation is about people, I mean that fish are doing everything right, right? Like corals are trying their damnedest to survive. Like it's us that are the problem, and we can also be a significant part of the solution. And part of that solution is just backing off and letting nature do its thing. And so when I think about ocean conservation, this is the photograph that comes to mind, which surprises a lot of people because there's no water in this picture. There are no fish in this picture. So I'll describe to you a little bit more about what this is. So for a few years, I was leading the Wait Institute, which was working with Caribbean island communities and governments to completely re-envision their relationship with the ocean and develop ocean zoning plans that would reflect their concerns and priorities to restore their ocean resources and sustain them into the future. So the idea was just the same way that we do zoning on land, we can do zoning in the ocean, protected areas, but also shipping areas and anchoring areas, recreational areas, offshore energy, whatever is needed. And so in the process of working with this community in Barbuda, which is part of the nation of Antigua and Barbuda in the northeast corner of the Caribbean, population was about 1,500 at the time. I was tasked with organizing the community consultations. And I realized that a lot of the people I most wanted to hear from were not showing up at the town hall meetings. This is not unique to Barbuda. Town hall meetings are not super popular unless it gets the moments where it gets really rowdy. But in general, there's not great turnout. And so I found myself really wanting to hear from the fishermen who I knew would have opinions after the fact. I wanted to make sure to get their perspectives before. And so what you're seeing in this picture is basically the moment after I slammed on the brakes because I realized there were a bunch of people playing dominoes and drinking beer on the side of the road that weren't showing up at the town hall meetings, and this was my chance to corner them. And so this is actually very similar to my PhD research where I interrupted dominoes games in Curacao to do socioeconomic interviews with hundreds of fishermen and dive instructors there and really understand the context within which ocean management was happening and what would be possible and supported by the public. So based on that, you'll see in this photo there is a laptop with a map on it that's showing a habitat map of the island, and they're thinking about what areas they would want to have as protected areas. But you'll notice they're all pointing at the paper map. And so when we think about the role of technology in planning, I think it's important to have a little bit of humility about technological solutions writ large. This is one very small example of that. You'll also notice there's these two guys pointing at the map. There's a few other people around them. Two of the people in this photo, or three of them, are fishermen. One is a fisheries officer, and another is a customs official. So we have an interesting cross-section of the people who would be affected by any new ocean policies. And then you have, in the background, these two guys with me. And the most important thing I think of when I see this picture now, not at the time, but now I'm like, oh, the white people are listening. This is a very good step. Because often what you have is people going into these communities and being like, we have the answer. We came here from Washington, D.C. and New York, and we've decided what your ocean policy should be, and we're going to spend the next 9 months shoving it down your throat until you sign it, we can go away, and then you don't enforce it because you never wanted it. And so we were trying very hard to avoid that by providing the tools that the community needed to make their own decisions about the future that they wanted to have. And so it worked. After a year and a half of public consultations, Barbuda passed arguably the most progressive ocean policy anywhere in the Caribbean. Their entire waters are zoned out to 3 nautical miles. A third of the ocean jurisdiction is protected, which includes a third of each habitat type, so it's not just a bunch of sand they're protecting. No export or finning of sharks, parrotfish, and urchins are protected. Mangroves and seagrasses are protected unless you have a permit. There's all sorts of really important elements of this, including establishing the potential for limiting the amount of fishing in the future with a permit system. The problem with this is that as part of a twin island state, Barbuda doesn't actually have complete control over what happens. Antigua, where the central government is located, has a lot to say about it. And the context for this is that Barbuda is arguably the only real example of reparations in the Western Hemisphere. So when slavery ended, the entire island, all the land, was turned over collectively to the people of that island. And there has never been private land ownership on Barbuda. So if you want to come and buy land, you can't, because there's no purchase or sale of land. And so this makes it really hard for developers, because they need to get the community, the entire island, to agree to give a lease. And they don't like most development projects because of the impact that they have on the environment, because they're not actually employing local people. And so there was this huge push to get this massive resort established, and the communities just said no. And then Hurricane Irma hit, and the eye of that storm went right over Barbuda, and they lost touch with the rest of the world for 48 hours. And some crazy things happened during that storm, and it's amazing that only one person died. It's an absolute miracle. But what happened is a classic case of disaster capitalism, where a resort that couldn't get approval suddenly got approval from the Antiguan government. And this guy, who you might recognize, was the primary backer behind it. So Robert De Niro used this hurricane as an excuse to get approval for the resort that would take over a large portion of Barbuda's property with no commitment to environmental protections or employing local people. And so this was the moment that I met Naomi Klein. I was running through JFK Airport on my way who knows where, and someone had connected us, a mutual friend, and I was like, we need to get this story out. Will you please tell this story? And she was on her way to Puerto Rico to do some reporting there after the storm, and with a colleague, Aline Brown, got this story out, trying to make sure that this didn't go unnoticed. And this made a splash, but it didn't change anything. And the island has yet to recover. And so this, for me, is a heartbreaking example of a community that works really hard to do everything right, to plan for the long term and plan for the future, but you can't stop a hurricane. There was nothing that they could do about that. And in the aftermath, most of the people still haven't returned to the island. And so, sort of a depressing way to start a talk, but I think it's really important to be realistic about who bears the brunt of these things, and who is the most well-poised to benefit. And so when I think about ocean justice, this is the thing that comes to mind, because I spent years there working, living with this community. And then there are pictures like this, where you see about a year ago, Representative Ocasio-Cortez sitting in with the youth of the Sunrise Movement in Nancy Pelosi's office before she's even sworn in, which was a huge act of bravery, and she talked about later how terrifying it was to, like, imagine on the first day of high school, you're like, watch me be really unpopular, ready, set, go. But she did it, and Sunrise Movement and her efforts and the storytelling of so many people are the reason that we're even talking about a Green New Deal today. But I read the Green New Deal, and I was thinking, okay, so what does this mean for the ocean? Because the ocean has absorbed a third, approximately, of the CO2 we've emitted. It's absorbed about 93% of the heat that's been trapped by greenhouse gases, and the ocean can also be a really big part of the solution. So I eagerly go to read the Green New Deal resolution. Who here has read it? Who here knows how long it is? It's like 12 pages, double-spaced, massive font. It'll take you like 5 minutes. Everyone thinks it's like a 1,000-page document. It's 12 pages. It's available on Congress website. And so people also think it's just AOC's thing, but in reality, there are 95 co-sponsors in the House and 14 in the Senate. And because of the organizing efforts of Sunrise and others, every Democratic presidential candidate has endorsed a Green New Deal, and they also were pushing for the work to get us a climate debate, which ended up in a town hall, et cetera. So, but when I read it, you can't see this, but I've circled the most important word in the entire document, which is ocean, which appears once on page 10. And it's just like a general, like, we should ensure public lands, waters, and oceans are protected. And And that's not enough, right? Like, let's be a little bit more detailed about it. So with 2 colleagues, I co-authored this op-ed called The Big Blue Gap in the Green New Deal. And we identify ways that the ocean can be part of the solution. So we can restore and protect coastal ecosystems, wetlands and marshes and mangroves. I can't tell you how happy I was to hear mangroves get a shout out in that video that The Intercept did with Naomi, because mangroves never get nearly half the love they deserve. But wetlands can absorb 5 times more carbon in their soil, sequester it, than a tropical forest. So we should really be, thanking wetlands for all they do for us and protecting and restoring them, for example. They buffer the impact of storms. They help buffer against the impacts of sea level rise, and can be much more cost effective than seawalls and other sort of engineering fortification. So like nature does it best. There's also the opportunity for renewable energy offshore, and wind offshore is actually more reliable and stronger than wind on land. There's also a huge blue economy in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars in the US, but at the same time, shipping, if it were a country, would be the 6th largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So shipping is a hugely polluting industry. But there's obviously a lot of other sectors of the blue economy. Tourism is a big one, as well as fishing. And there's also this idea of regenerative ocean farming. How can we farm seaweed and shellfish, oysters and mussels and clams in a way that absorbs carbon while feeding us in a healthy, nutritious way? And eating oysters can actually be have a lower carbon footprint than being vegan, because it's such an efficient way to make protein. So after that, there was so much interest in this concept of like a blue New Deal, which is not a separate thing, but the idea that we need to include the ocean in the Green New Deal, that I developed this more detailed policy memo with a few colleagues that went into designing a little bit from the level of federal policy, what would it look like to actually invest in like this blue carbon, this ocean and marine carbon sequestration potential? And what would it look like to really support sustainable community-based fisheries and build out that local infrastructure? And how could we actually catalyze this restorative ocean farming? And so we came to this conclusion that it was time to radically re-envision our relationship with the ocean in the context of climate change and this opportunity for a Green New Deal. At the same time, I'm a Brooklyn native, and so I think a lot about the future of coastal cities, and I wrote this piece for the New York Times a few months ago talking about the risk that New York faces in the context of rising seas and storms. And specifically, 85% of wetlands in New York and New Jersey have been lost already, but what remained prevented over $600 million in damage from Hurricane Sandy. And so that is the motivation for the project that I'm starting now, which is called Urban Ocean Lab, which is a think tank for the future of coastal cities. And the premise for that is that we really need to envision and design the future that we want collectively, using our collective wisdom. And from there, we can build the policy frameworks and the legislative approaches that we need to enable that future. So 1/3 of Americans live in coastal cities, and we're just really unprepared for the amount of sea level rise and other impacts that are coming. But cities can actually be a laboratory for what's possible at the state and local level, as well as just being needed for cities. So how can we combine collective wisdom and this idea of visioning and design to create these targeted solutions that would lead to policy change? And so my personal mantra, and the way that I decide what to spend my time on, is that building community around solutions is the most important thing. So that's why it's really great that we're all gathered here today. And this is one example of it. So after the last UN report came out on ocean and ice, I gathered scientists and policy experts and activists and artists and filmmakers and journalists to talk through what the report said, and more specifically to talk through what was needed in terms of narratives to push forward solutions. Because everyone talked about these sort of like apocalyptic scientific projections, which are real, but they don't help us decide what to do. And in all of these reports, there are extensive explanations of what the solutions are, and we wanted to focus on those. And so the last thing I want to leave you with is my other effort to build community around solutions, which is to support women climate leaders and diverse women who are leading on climate. And so this summer I had the opportunity to co-host, facilitate, curate a group of 30 women spending a week together on a ranch in Montana, and figuring out what we could do together. Because the question is not like, what can I do? What can you do? It's what can we do? And so hopefully this gives you some good feelings like it does for me. Can we play the video?
When I was young, I fell in love with this world.
I fell in love with the silence of the desert, the smell of the earth after rain,
the plains of South Dakota. I fell in love with the way that the world holds us.
I am a climate scientist.
I am a Palestinian Texan.
An all-around general nerd.
I am an immigrant.
An advocate.
I'm a leader. I am a black girl from the hood who's trying to change climate policy.
When I look around today, I see a lot of brokenness,
corruption, divisions between the haves and the have-nots,
living systems of the planet fraying.
And I feel worried about our future.
I feel grief.
I feel ashamed.
Really angry.
Heartbroken. Numb. On good days, I feel courageous.
To me, the climate crisis
is an economic issue.
It's an immigration issue.
Spiritual issue.
A feminist issue.
A right now issue. It's the ultimate intersectional justice issue.
I'm determined to be part of the solution because I want there to be children on this planet in 7 generations.
Because everyone has a role to play.
Because it's the right thing to do.
It's easy to imagine a future that is bleak.
I can also imagine transformation.
People rising in resilience.
100% clean energy.
Farms that sequester carbon in their soil.
A world that is inclusive.
A future that works for all of us.
I am a woman.
I'm a woman. I am leading on climate.
We are leading on climate.
Join us.
Join us.
Our last panelist is Dan Cohen. And following Dan, we will, fingers crossed, hear from Marshall.
All right, good morning. How's everybody doing? Great. I am optimistic in the morning and grumpy at the same time. So, strange combination. So, let's see, here we go. We're going to talk about the Green New Deal for housing right now. We're in a planetary emergency, as you all know. All but the most aggressive emissions cuts leave us with a very significant chance of extreme warming above 3 degrees Celsius. So it's a good thing that we have ideas about how to stop that from happening. I've just co-written a book called The Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, and it's with 3 fabulous co-authors, Kate, Alyssa, and Thea, and with a foreword from Naomi Klein, who's with us today. And the book is all fresh material, but one of the things that we talk about in it is this idea of a Green New Deal for housing, which is an idea I've been advancing in articles in Jacobin, The Guardian, The Nation, and elsewhere, and I want to share with you a little bit about that today. And the reason I want to talk about housing is not that it's the only thing a Green New Deal can do, but it exemplifies, I think, 3 of the core premises of the Green New Deal idea, which are 1, really rapid decarbonization, 2, jobs for everybody, and then 3rd, closing the racial wealth gap, ending inequalities of race and class. And this has been confusing, I think, for a lot of the economists and sort of centrist wonks who've said, how dare you, or how could you possibly yoke all these social problems onto the urgent, pressing task of just decarbonizing? And we've heard a bit about this today. And what I'll hope try to show you this morning is that when you follow the carbon off of the charts and into the pipes and bricks and glass and concrete and wood and steel that we literally live inside of, then you find that there is no possible separation between social issues and climate change, and that by far the most effective and efficient and intelligent way to build political support and decarbonize at the same time is to attack carbon and inequality at literally at the exact same time and in physically the exact same places. So let's just move ahead here. I know a bit about following the carbon because I run a center that does that. But I want to get into this idea, again, of the built environment. And I want to note, I'm not going to be talking about the rest of the world, but the rest of the world really matters. And what's so exciting about the housing piece of climate change and the built environment more broadly is that if we can find ways to reduce energy use really significantly through changes to housing and then how we get around the kinds of density that Naomi talked about earlier, then we reduce the number of wind turbines and solar panels and batteries that we have to build. And that means far less mining and extraction in the rest of the world. And it also means making solar panels and wind turbines available to other countries that may not have as much money as we have in the United States. So reducing energy use in the United States is not the only thing we have to do, but it's a necessary condition for global solidarity, right? We have to use the absolute minimum amount of energy. Right now we use the most. Dramatically reducing how much energy we use at home through domestic policy is a form of global solidarity. Not the only form, but an important one. Okay, so housing. How does housing fit into this picture? I've made the argument that we need to build millions and millions and millions of units of new, no-carbon, beautiful social housing, and that we need to retrofit all the housing we have now, and in particular, target public housing that already exists and low-income housing where residents don't have the ability to kind of do green upgrades necessarily on their own, but we have to help and lift them up through federal green investment. And just by even the Center for American Progress, which you're all probably too cool to know about, but is a very boring think tank run by people who have been around for a long time, even they think that we should start building new green social housing. Okay, so why do we need to do this? Very quickly, some key reasons. Housing is as important to inequality as is unemployment, right? So we talk a lot about jobs. We also have to talk about housing. The racial wealth gap in this country has everything to do with terrible decisions made in the New Deal that created redlining and that essentially hardened Jim Crow and turned the Great Migration's liberatory promise into, in many ways, a reproduction of apartheid. The housing crisis is not something you can solve with private homeownership programs alone, and Kyanga Yamada-Taylor, who's a wonderful professor and friend at Princeton, has shown very clearly how efforts to increase black and brown homeownership with public-private partnerships have in fact trapped black and brown families in cycles of predatory debt. So we need an option that's better than just the lower end of the market. Housing is also where the energy crisis literally converges with our everyday life. 1/3 of Americans cannot afford their utility bills. 1/3 of Americans can't afford their utility bills. That means they've had a utility shut-off notice, sacrificed essentials like food, or kept their home at an unsafe temperature. And this is also, of course, in the United States, very racialized. In the Mid-Atlantic region, half of black households cannot afford to pay their utility bills. So we have to transform these homes to make them livable, safe, healthy, and absolutely affordable. The second thing is that we're going to have a lot of people moving around. There will be, we hope, a lot of immigration into the United States as we have extreme weather. Sea level rise alone will easily displace over 10 million, up to 12, 13 million Americans by the end of the century. And as we heard just now from Naomi, other threats like wildfires are also going to cause displacement. And we have to ask, what are the conditions under which the next great migration, the climate great migration, won't reproduce apartheid, won't even be a traumatic experience, but what are we going to have to do in terms of building beautiful new social homes so that entire communities can move into new places that they love, and they won't feel trapped in fire zones, they won't feel trapped in flood zones, they won't, in the case of something like Katrina, be told, oh, sorry, your house is gone, here's a voucher, good luck on the housing market. Nobody wants to hang out on the housing market with a voucher. You don't even want to hang out on the housing market with $500,000 probably. And that's the case of like 5% of Americans. So we really need to think about what are the conditions under which all these changes will be beautiful and affirming and community building and not just, and not at all traumatic. Third, we need to just simply decarbonize the building sector, and leveraging public housing is a great way to get started and to build skills. Buildings consume almost 40% of energy in the United States. Private homes are responsible for 1/6 of greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to go directly to the source of the problem and make interventions. In the book, I argue for a concept called sunflower homes, where we try to organize using automation, but algorithms that are subject to public scrutiny. So those of you in coding school will be in charge, not let Google Nest and Alexa take over our lives. And you might think to yourself, well, Professor Cohen, or Daniel, please come Daniel. Well, Daniel, that's a really great idea, but what does public housing have to do with all these cutting edge appliances? Well, probably nobody in this room knows that in the 1990s, NYCHA, New York's housing authority, partnered with NYPA, New York State's public energy utility. They partnered and they set up a contest and said, which company can build the country's first energy efficient apartment-sized fridge? And if you build it, we will buy tens and tens and tens of thousands of them, save tons of energy for social housing, and benefit all Americans. And Maytag won the contract. They built tens and thousands of these fridges in Iowa, which is an important place in presidential politics. All the replaced fridges were recycled in upstate New York. The housing authorities got the fridges for free because the utilities or the federal government, depending on the agency, realized all the savings from lower energy bills just within a few years. And what's really cool is that they allowed other public housing agencies all across the region to jump onto these bulk orders. So I think somebody talked about the role of markets before, and of course, even those of us who believe in a full economic democratic future, in the next few years, there's still ways that the public sector can drive innovation and still take advantage of the capabilities that exist in companies. And we argue in the book, talk a bit about this, and I've argued even more since then, that we could even have a public option for appliances. That if you belong to a community group in a neighborhood, why can't you get on the list to get that new electric induction stove, the kind of models that people are using in London? And I've even suggested in a Data for Progress report, we could name these after natural splendors in the United States. We could have Yellowstone stoves, so people could know what they're preserving with their, well, they don't need the stove to cook the oysters, but if they're cooking scapes or anything to go with them. Okay, so this agenda, the idea of building a massive amount of new, green, no-carbon social housing would have seemed fanciful 6 months ago, might have seemed fanciful a year ago, but thanks to very powerful organizing by tenants, in particular, black and brown tenants all over the country, we now have on the national agenda the idea of a homes guarantee. They've called for 12 million units of new, green social homes to be built all over the country, and within 3 weeks of their platform coming out, it was endorsed by the Bernie Sanders campaign, which is also now campaigning on a Green New Deal for housing. And now, this past weekend, I was very lucky to lead the research in support of a bill that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders introduced, supported also by Elizabeth Warren, a Green New Deal for Public Housing Act. The idea is in 10 years, the Green New Deal decade, retrofit every single public housing unit in the United States, create hundreds of thousands of jobs every single year, bring these buildings up to the highest standards of livability, and lower prices and develop skills and capabilities for the whole economy in the 21st century green buildings sector, right? So just as in the 1930s, you wouldn't have solved congestion by building an extra lane for horse-drawn carriages. Well, in the 21st century, you don't make homes healthy and comfortable with fossil fuels. You electrify and you make them efficient with the best possible technology. And one of the things we did with this research is we showed that these public housing communities are in fact all over the country. You'd create more jobs in red states than blue states. But in most cities, most public housing is concentrated, as you would expect, in black and brown communities with high degrees of unemployment. So this form of green investment is really a form of community uplift for the black and brown communities that have been left behind in the United States since its founding on purpose. And now is the time to change that. There is also a lot of public housing in poor, rural, white communities. And again, this is an issue that does affect the whole country. And so we draw a lot of attention to the fact that this is spread around the whole United States, but I think we have to focus on the racial and economic justice dimensions of this. And it's actually extremely popular. All the polling that we have done with Data for Progress finds over and over, even when you tell people, Republican and Democratic talking points, massive majority support for green investment in public homes, for retrofitting public homes to get rid of carbon pollution, to get rid of lead, to get rid of mold, to create union-paying jobs for residents of public housing. So super exciting idea that I think tells a very, very clear story. What does it mean to tackle carbon pollution and inequality at the exact same time and in the exact same place? Now, the United States does not have the best history of public housing, again, because of errors in the New Deal. And I think for a bit of inspiration, it's helpful to take a detour to the hilariously fancy seeming city of Vienna in Europe, which in the 1920s and 30s read Vienna. And Vienna is a city that has been governed by the left the entire history of the city. The only time the left was defeated was by fascists in a civil war in the 1930s. But they built tons and tons of social housing in the 20s and 30s, like the Karl Marx Hof housing complex behind me, 1,200 families, very beautiful. It was literally shelled by Nazis in the 1930s when they attacked. And today in Vienna, 1/3 of all housing is public housing, and 1/3 of all housing is cooperative housing. And this is what social housing looks like in Vienna. Carbon emissions are through the floor. They built social housing from the start in every single zip code in the city, so that nobody was put into any kind of discriminatory zone where anybody knew where you came from. The vision was, we're going to lift up everybody. And yeah, how are you going to pay for it? They taxed champagne. They taxed racehorses. 1/3 of the money for the social housing literally came from luxury taxes. They didn't tax the first servant that you had, but they taxed the second, which is kind of funny. And by the way, if you were following events in Washington, D.C., the Brookings Institute, another one of our favorite centrist think tanks, they went to Vienna in 1934 and said, this is a waste of money. You should have built concrete shacks for workers in the suburbs. So that's the vision of the people who say a Green New Deal is too ambitious. Concrete shacks in the suburbs and decarbonization on their backs. So that's not what we're going to do. Now, the Red Vienna inspired an architect called Roland Wank, who was a Hungarian architect, came to the United States in 1924. He wanted to kind of chase his own version of the American dream. And Wank built an homage to Red Vienna in 1931 in the Lower East Side of New York City for Italian and Jewish garment workers. This is a beautiful housing complex that has rooftop balconies so that the workers would dance and play violin into the end of the night. They had a theater on the ground floor. They had care facilities in the housing complex. This was truly a vision of social housing that if others had won the internal battles in the New Deal, would have become the American public housing ideal. Wank went on from building social housing in New York City to become the chief architect of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built, as we heard, dams all across the southern United States. He intentionally built them to have a charisma, a kind of integrated relationship with that part of the country, and 4.5 million Americans visited the dams of the Tennessee Valley Authority just in the 1930s alone. So there was a vision. There was a vision that you would have public goods that would benefit all people, inspired by the best examples all over the world, and this was kind of the best part of the New Deal. We do remember that the New Deal also, again, entrenched segregation. I think we have to learn a very important lesson from W.B. Du Bois writing in the New Deal, his classic book, Black Reconstruction. And what Du Bois said is that if you throw black radicalism under the bus, all workers are going to suffer, and black workers are going to suffer the most. And the challenge for the Green New Deal is to not throw black radicalism, black communities of color, the environmental justice communities that have built the Green New Deal in many ways. We stand on the shoulders of those giants. But we have to double down on the black and brown organizing in cities and communities all over the country. And I think when we do that, we can then start to rescue the best ideas of that New Deal era and our best current ideas, which is that there aren't just wires linking renewable public power to green, social, healthy, affordable homes, but there is a dream, which is that ordinary people control their own place in the world. And I think that we can go back to a very interesting article that Roland Wank, who I was just showing you his picture, wrote in 1941, because when Naomi was talking earlier, it reminded me what Wank wrote so much echoes what we're experiencing now with the Nazi threat in Europe. Wank wrote, "Security is no longer within the independent reach of even the most powerful individual. Wealth no longer comes in forms which may be hoarded within four walls. Permanence itself may be an anachronism in a world of accelerating change, hindrance to continuous readjustment." So there's this idea at this desperate time, we have to build things collectively together, but wealth is not possible for individuals. Wealth is not possible for individuals. And so Wank kind of closes his essay, I think, with statements that are powerful to us today. It's not about architecture, but it's about social change. To plan a housing development, a roadside restaurant, a school, or a powerhouse is not any different or more useful than to mend boots, run a lathe, or total up accounts. But to share in a forward struggle when the fight is hot and passion runs high is one of the vital experiences that make life worth living. And I think we can close with the essay, the title to that essay, which I think is what gets me out of bed every single morning, "Nowhere to go but forward." Nowhere to go but forward. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, I'm very happy to introduce Marshall Shepard, our last panelist, and we're so delighted that he was able to join us. One of the reasons, I don't know if he's going to mention it, but that he's actually coming remotely is sort of a real commitment to reducing flying, reducing sort of work-related travel, and especially the emissions around that, so sort of really kind of, you know, walking the walk in that way. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and hopefully you all can hear me just fine. I actually had the honor of spending the morning with President Obama, who's here in the Atlanta area, speaking at the Greenbuild International Conference, and his words were inspiring, but what it also did is it placed my remarks at the end. So I'm tasked to talk about the science motivating the Green New Deal, so I guess you can sort of see me as the gloom and doom speaker for this particular session, but I always end with on a positive note. So I am actually at the University of Georgia, for those that don't know me, and a former president of the American Meteorological Society. And I started off with this particular graphic because it shows sea surface temperatures and hurricane activity, intensity, rapid intensification, stalling of hurricanes has been at the epicenter, if you will, of many of the discussions about climate change. And so this is a nice backdrop because there are many implications of climate change and motivations for the Green New Deal, but certainly elevated sea surface temperatures, stronger hurricanes, and all of the things and risk associated with that come to bear, particularly in light of the previous speaker. I actually have a talk that I give on the extreme weather climate gap, which gets at the heart of many of those sort of inequity, climate justice issues that you just heard about, and which are also at the very heart of the Green New Deal. This is a very interesting picture in that for those of you that have visited Georgia, this is the road that connects Savannah, Georgia to Tybee Island, one of its barrier islands. Residents had never seen anything like this, many say. It wasn't because of a hurricane or a storm, but a king tide. And so the main road that connects, it's about, I don't know, 10, 15 mile road that connects Savannah to Tybee Island. And they're now seeing instances of these king tide floods. That sets the stage for, and I'm going to turn this down.
The atmosphere. The answer is blowing in the wind.
This is actually a look at the 2017 hurricane season, talking about other extremes. And I chair NASA's Earth Science Advisory Committee, so this is a resource that I received at NASA a couple of years ago, showing you the 2017 hurricane season and also many other extremes going on. Here comes Hurricane Harvey as it crosses the ocean. As we all recall, Hurricane Harvey made landfall in Texas, parked itself over Houston, and dumped almost 50 inches of rainfall. That's about a year's worth of rainfall in about a week. Notice also the dust coming off of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Sahel Africa. Notice the wildfires up in Canada and the Iberian Peninsula. And there comes Hurricane Irma. The reason I like to start talks like that with this type of visualization is that people notice and feel extremes. Hurricane Jose. As we move forward, we're going to see Hurricane Maria. As we recall, there were many inequity and social justice issues around Maria as it devastated Puerto Rico, our fellow citizens, by the way. We knew that it was coming, so there was certainly no excuse for not preparing for what was headed their way. The last thing that I want to show in this image is Hurricane Ophelia. You're going to see Ophelia form in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. That in itself is quite interesting, but watch what Hurricane Ophelia does next. It doesn't head off to the west, it heads up towards Ireland. Wait, no, you're supposed to be going the other way. And that is what we're seeing more of. We saw that just this year. Hurricanes forming in places they shouldn't be, and hurricanes stalling, as we saw with Harvey, or intensifying. And so I was just on Capitol Hill about a month or so ago testifying before the U.S. House of Representatives Science Committee. And one of the things that I told them in that briefing is that extremes are becoming more extreme and people feel them far more than averages. That's very important because when we talk about climate change, look, I love polar bears and I love butterflies and all of those things, but what I'm most concerned about is how these extreme events manifest themselves in everyday lives of citizens here in the United States and globally, particularly the most vulnerable of those citizens. So many of you have seen things like this before. The sort of image that's really hot right now is the climate stripes that many of you may wear on your scarves or ties. I actually like this version, but it shows over the last 150 or so years, as we've moved into the most recent decades, there's been an acceleration of warming. And as a climate scientist, that's a point that I always try to emphasize. It's not just that we're warming, it's that the warming has accelerated. If you think back to your calculus class and think about derivatives or rate of change, as a climate scientist, I'm concerned that some of the changes that we're seeing in the climate system are happening on the span of years to decades instead of hundreds of years to thousands of years. That's a key message that I hope we can all convey to our stakeholders and our audiences, and certainly is a reason why a Green New Deal and the motivation for it has been put forth by some. Again, another sort of way of looking at essentially the same thing. Clearly, we've seen warming temperatures over the last 100 or so years. I actually added this in. This was something that was sent out by my colleague Gavin over at NASA GISS. And according to Gavin Schmidt at NASA GISS, we are likely living within the second warmest year on record, 2019, when all is said and done. This is sort of a sneak preview of some graphics that he tweeted last week, sort of giving us a heads up. And we've seen all-time warm months, but it looks as though 2019 is likely going to finish. And I think he said there's about an 85% chance of this as the second warmest year on record. Now, that's singing the same old song that we've been hearing for the last 2 decades. I mean, most of our warmest years on record are coming now in the last 2 decades or so. And I think, again, I'm preaching to the choir on this, but these are all motivating factors. Well, one question that I often get, particularly from the contrarian crowd or whatever we're calling them these days, well, how do you know it's us, Dr. Shepard? How do we know that human beings are the cause? We've long answered that question, and I don't know if many of you are like me, but and I try to avoid it, but I'm pretty sure my eyes roll sometimes when I get that question. But we know that greenhouse gases are the main culprit in this sort of climate sort of conundrum that we are experiencing. Yes, climate changes naturally. In fact, I get that question all the time. Dr. Shepard, does it climate change naturally? Haven't we always had hurricanes and extreme floods? Well, absolutely we have. And we know as climate scientists, I promise you that myself or Ayanna or others sitting in that room were not falling asleep when we were learning about how climate changes naturally in our graduate school classes. I promise you, we know that. But, and there is a but, and this is something that I like to talk about. This is a very well-known figure that we often see in the climate reports. But I like to put it this way. When I talk to my students at the University of Georgia, I said, who likes apple pie? And many of them say, I do. And I said, well, what's the most important ingredient in apple pies? And I let them think about it for a second. And they eventually come around and say, well, the apples. I say that because when we think about the climate apple pie, the greenhouse gases are the apples. And I say that because people will throw out these zombie theories. It's the sun, or, oh, it's aerosols, or it's cloud. These are the things that are causing the climate to change. No, those are the cinnamon and the sugar and the salt. The greenhouse gases are the apples. They are the most significant driver in the radiative forcing that we see in our climate system. And so don't get lost in those sort of narratives that we hear about other things driving climate. You know, the favorite one these days is sunspot activity and solar activity. I've written in Forbes about why that's a zombie theory, a theory that scientists have long refuted, but they live on like zombies for those of you that like The Walking Dead. So with all of that said, the Green New Deal has been put forth. And look, I'm not an expert on all the economics and sort of policy implications of the Green New Deal. I'm here to establish the science. But one of the things that I do know is that my colleague Mark Jacobson, much of his thinking goes into at least some of the energy policy surrounding the Green New Deal. It's only one potential approach, but it's a very well-known approach. And so, for example, the Jacobson plan calls for 30% onshore winds, 19% offshore wind. 30% photovoltaics, and so on. And so these are the underlying sort of energy assumptions, if you will, about moving us to a fossil fuel-free energy economy, if you will. And again, the motivation for that is essentially everything that I just showed you. The apples in the climate apple pie, reducing fossil fuels, so-called mitigation. We have to have adaptation as a part of the mix, for sure. We have to adapt. We have to retrofit public housing units where we have vulnerable populations with air conditioning units and cooling stations during heat waves. We may have to consider seawalls or flood mitigation capabilities. Those are adaptation strategies. But these types of sort of renewable and reduction of our dependence on energy, fossil fuel energy, is mitigation. One final thing that I would leave you with in terms of the motivation from the science is that, again, I've been at this a while, and many of my colleagues in the room have as well. And we get this discussion about, well, it's natural, or climate change is naturally. And it's one of the most flawed narratives that I often hear, because it's not an either or proposition. It's not that climate changes naturally or humans are changing the climate. It's both. I mean, as I often say, grass grows naturally, but if you fertilize the soil, it grows differently. Baseball players could hit home runs naturally, but when they were using steroids in large volume in a recent era, they were hitting longer and more home runs. So we've got to move beyond this notion of it's either or. It's an and proposition. You know, as I draw to a close, this was a map that I believe was in the New York Times maybe 2 years ago or so, and it shows sort of a look at the predicted damage in the 2080 timeframe in terms of percent of county GDP, I believe per person or so. And for me, this map really hits home. I grew up in Georgia. I moved away and worked at NASA for several years at Goddard Space Flight Center, but in 2005, I returned to my home state. And if you look at this, the entire country is vulnerable, but I live in arguably one of the most vulnerable climate regions, the South. If you think about the South, we get every extreme weather event imaginable, from hurricanes to tornadoes, floods, extreme heat, cold, snowstorms, etc. And so not only are we exposed to many of the extreme weather events that we're going to face, if you also know something about the South, particularly the Black Belt of the South or some of the poverty-stricken regions of the South, we add those extreme weather events to an already vulnerable population socioeconomically. There's a very large percentage of the marginalized population here in the South. Also, if you look in the Southwest, but again, all over the country, this is a challenge. So as I close, I was asked to talk about the science motivation behind the Green New Deal. But I just want to remind us all as colleagues and scientists about messaging. I knew my audience today, so I did show graphs, but I hate showing graphs and figures and the things that we as scientists always do when we go to these conferences. I like to talk about the kitchen table issues. That's what's going to move the needle for the American public. The kitchen table issues. Look, positive trend lines and anomalies and PDFs. Oh, I mean, my mom or my cousin's eyes glaze over when we talk those things. When we talk about the cost of food, reduction in agricultural productivity leading to cost increases in the cost of Cheerios or tomatoes or wine, these are things that resonate with people. Energy supply, water supply, national security. So I encourage us all, when we're talking about the motivation for the Green New Deal, let's take it out of the science and even the policy wonkism and make it about people's kitchen table lives. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thanks all of our panelists for some wonderful talks. Let me now invite our panelists to come up and join me on the stage, and we're going to have sort of a kind of informal panel discussion led by some questions. I'll start with actually Naomi will make a few kind of observations and lead us off with a question, then I have a couple of questions, and then we have a hard stop at 12:30 to sort of shift toward lunch, and then we have poster presentations starting at 1. So we'll do our best to bring in an audience question or two, but I'm not going to promise it for sure, depending on how the time goes. So Come on up, guys. Come sit down.
Okay, hi everyone, hi again. Well, that was just an absolutely phenomenal panel. Can we thank everybody again? Because I thought it was just so wonderful. I really, I love this idea of kind of looking backwards and forwards at the same time. And I spoke earlier about just feeling that having done a lot of talks about this crisis, that maybe, in my opinion, the most powerful force we're up against is not climate change denial. It is the sense of inevitability and a feeling of, oh, we could never do this, and a sort of internalization of hyper-individualism, that we're told we aren't capable of doing big things together. And so, history can be quite radicalizing in that, in reminding people of times when we did act together, and taking both warning and inspiration from that. And I think that theme came out in a couple of the talks. I also really appreciated this sort of spirit of constructive critique. And I think that there are holes, absolutely, big holes, as Ayanna pointed out, a ocean-sized hole in the original framing. And yet this isn't a moment where, if we look at Dr. Shepard's graphs, and I know there are many experts in this room, there's no spare planet, for climate experts that we get to go to after we've critiqued everybody else's plans. We actually have to make it better. If we see holes, we need to fill them. And I definitely see that in the interventions that people are making in this moment that are so constructive. Dr. Shepard said that the extremes are becoming more extreme. And I would just add that that's not just true of the weather, right? That we are living in these extreme times. And these disruptions that we are seeing, they are acting as an accelerant, right, to all kinds of inequalities and injustices. So when people claim that it's possible to pry carbon out of the broader economic and social context in which our responses necessarily play out, it may be with the best of intentions, and it may be with the idea that this is actually making it easier, but I think that what we see from some of the examples that were discussed here is that our existing system, when these climate disruptions bear down, if you don't design for justice, then injustice accelerates. And Ayanna's example about Barbuda, to me, one of the most devastating examples. Devastating in the same way that, but worse, in the same way that Chico is devastating, because people tried so hard to do good, but were pitted against each other nonetheless. Ayanna's example from Barbuda of this amazing place where their ancestors had fought and won reparations and had communal land holdings, and in their moment of greatest need, that was their trauma and literal absence was exploited in order to undo that great victory. Another example of that is public housing. Daniel made reference to New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina. That was my entry into this climate discussion. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm somebody who is focused on economic justice and human rights. I was writing about disaster capitalism and found myself in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, while the city was still partially underwater, and when land developers were already making plans to tear down the public housing that was intact, that actually had not been devastated by the hurricane, because it, like Barbuda, opened up that opportunity. So when we don't design, I mean, to me, the message of this is if we do not design for justice, and this is, I think, a lesson also from Neil's talk about what the lessons we should take from the original New Deal, the warnings we should take, is that if we do not design to repair these injustices, they will deepen. They will not stay static. Nothing in this stays static. So my question that I want to throw to all of you is, you are all clearly so invested in this. We know that these next 11 years are the years we will do it or not. We will either cut global emissions in half and win ourselves a good shot of keeping temperatures below 1.5, or we won't do it. So I want to ask you a personal question, which is, how does that inform your lives? How does that inform the choices you make in these fateful years? Why don't we start with Neil?
I think it's hit home to me in a personal way because I have 2 young children, and
try to direct it.
Sure. Is that better? Yeah. It's on a personal level. I mean, it's what I study. It's what I've been. I was an environmental activist before I became a historian, and then I became an environmental historian for reasons that allowed me to connect my intellectual interest in history with my social activist interests as well. So I have a history of that personal connection, but I think that contemporary moment is more relevant to me because I have 2 young children. And whenever I hear these sorts of conversations, I just can't help but keep thinking, what is it going to be like for them when they're 15? We're not talking when they're like 60, when they're 15 years old. So for me, it's the intellectual and that personal coming together in ways that make me scared.
I have a lot of reactions to living in this reality. On like a super personal note, I basically cry every day. Because you read the headlines, and if you allow yourself to become numb, then we've lost, right? And not everyone will cry when they read a headline about the collapse of insect populations, per se, or the impact of the air quality problems that go along with fossil fuels that are shortening the lives of children everywhere. I mean, children have like little lungs and sensitive hearts, and they cannot handle all the pollution that goes along with burning fossil fuels. So I just allow myself to shed tears for it. I mean, I don't weep every day, but like I tear up almost every day when I read this stuff. But I don't want to stop learning about it. But at the same time, I sometimes, I did not read the entire IPCC report on oceans and ice. I read the summary for policymakers, and I was like, that's actually as much as I need to know in this moment to make decisions about the work I need to do, and I can always like reference more of it later. So there are times when I protect myself emotionally by not reading every single detail. It's also like very time consuming to keep up because it's changing so fast and the science is being updated so quickly. But as far as how it influences my work, it honestly leads me to overwork. Like, I'm writing a book, I'm co-editing an anthology of essays by women climate leaders, I'm starting a think tank, I'm working on a podcast. Like, it's too much. And it all feels important, and because I don't have children, the hours that I would be caring for them, I'm working instead. But it's also led me to do things like, instead of saving for my retirement, investing in my family farms upstate New York with my mother, because that is more important to the future, and we don't actually know what the economy is going to do, and helping to create what she has come to call the overground railroad for climate refugees. Like, how are we going to take care of each other in the future? And it sounds like really crazy, but we need to think about, in a future where we need to feed ourselves and relocalize, what does that actually mean? So those are just, and also like a lot of really crazy solo dance parties in my living room, because, that's how we get through these things.
Thank you for this question. I was prepared to talk about gentrification and property values, but so I'm Canadian. I grew up in Toronto, and my father was Jewish, and my mother is Guatemalan. And so there's a genocide of indigenous people in Guatemala in the 1980s, and of course everybody knows about the Holocaust. And I think, yeah, growing up, the lesson that I got was, and it's I think a lesson from Latin American and from Jewish history, when people tell you the apocalypse is coming, the lesson is not it's going to be fine. The lesson is you have to do something. You really have to do something. So, you know, at night, I of course have extreme moments of despair about this. I mean, I think often that we worry too much about weather and not enough about violence. And I think some of what we talked about today covers that. I think the only way through it, for me, has been two things. One, breaking the problem down into pieces where you're like, okay. I mean, if you look at all the projections, let's say the IPCC's 1.5 degree Celsius report was extremely scary. But then if you go into the report, it turns out that they have an argument that if you tackle inequality and have feminist social care policies and share technologies around the world, you can actually reduce emissions, wildly reduce suffering at the same time. But even that is too abstract. So I try to really focus in on ideas that are really, really concrete, even literally low carbon concrete. There's even actually in Vermont a group of people making hempcrete where they use hemp as an input instead of sand, and it sequesters carbon in the concrete. So I try to focus on these short-term like social solutions that have a major social benefit and major carbon reduction at the same time and really try to flesh those out. And then the other thing is to really just think 5-year time horizon. Like 2030, certainly 2050 is way too far in the future. I think we need to grapple with the next decade as the decade, and what can we do to post wins in a year or 2 years or 3 years that will make a concrete difference in a life of somebody who can say, I put up the solar panel, I insulated this home, I installed this new electric stove, and that is motivation to fight for more. So I think we have to be thinking like, win, ratchet up, win, ratchet up, win, ratchet up. I mean, some of the most banal advice from the like self-care industry really applies to climate change. Like you have to put wins up on the board and use those to motivate you, and you cannot have long-term deadlines. Because you know, anybody in academia knows long-term deadlines are the death of anything. So yeah, we just have to do it, and there's a lot to do.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in on that. You know, I want to pick up on the question about kids because I have a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old. And, you know, one of the things that really does kind of make me twitch a little bit is when I deal with some of the narrative from the contrarian folks. And, you know, I say, look, this is not a game. I mean, I don't want to win. I don't want to be right about this because if I'm right, my kids ultimately lose. And so one of the things that I really try to emphasize is that, you know, as scientists, we're just here to convey what we're trained to study. And I will add to that, you know, increasingly we have to engage beyond the ivory tower. We have to be in those hearings. We have to be on Twitter. I mean, Ayana's very good in social media. We've got to be in those spaces. We can't stay perched in our ivory towers. And I still have colleagues that tell me, I don't do that new Twitter stuff. Newsflash, it's not new. It's been around, and that's where you reach policymakers, you reach the media, you reach students. There are probably people following this meeting right now on the hashtag. And so we've got to embrace those things. On a personal note, you know, I've done some personal things. I've dramatically reduced my flying. Look, part of that is I just don't like to fly. So but also there's a carbon footprint issue. And I've gone to a couple of days a week where I'm not eating meat. These are little incremental things that at the grand scheme of things are, you know, aren't going to move the needle as much as sort of transformational action in terms of policy and global initiatives and treaties like the Paris Agreement, if you will. But they're a start, and they can serve purposes for inspiring. So I guess that's what I've done in response to your question on a personal level. But I know my bigger contribution and what my passion is, because I've got all the bells and whistles of academia, all the publications and the grants and the awards. I spend a good deal of my time right now trying to be a bridge to people that can change or move the needle on this issue.
Can I add something to my answer? I hadn't thought it through yet. So I think the video that I showed is actually one of my coping mechanisms. Like, there are so many amazing people that you get to collaborate while you're working on these solutions. Like, lovely and funny and generous and supportive colleagues. So that's been a big part of what I do. Thanks, Marshall, for the shout out about my tweets being legit. Still working on that. But I never intended to become a public figure. But you realize that, like, if your voice can help be a part of shifting the narrative, that's important. So my work has actually moved out of academia and out of the ivory tower, and I really think a lot about how I can help with the cultural shift that needs to happen that creates the sort of window of opportunity for policy shift. So a lot of my work now thinking about like advising Hollywood films and podcasts and books and like all of the, and social media, and like how do we just like shift the status quo in terms of what people expect there. And then the last thing, which is something that we can all do, which I spent basically the whole last year doing, is trying to understand how my skills mapped onto solutions, right? Because people are always asking me, like, what can I do? I'm like, I don't know, what are you good at? We don't all need to do the same thing. And so I realized, like, as a marine biologist who's really concerned about climate, who's a Brooklyn native, that I could create this hub for thought leadership on the future of coastal cities. And like, maybe that could be my part of where all of my skills and interests come together. And I think that's something I would encourage all of us to do. Certainly we should all do the basics, but find those special things that only you can do.
Just very quickly to add, something we can do within academia is teach. And the last 2 years, all I'm teaching is environmental justice. That's all I'm going to do because that's what turns me on. That's how I feel that I can communicate to my students. They get turned on, and I think it's very important to keep that in mind.
Great, so those are really, really provocative, really interesting sort of thoughts to get us started. So I guess I wanted to kind of maybe even continue on the sort of train that we're on a little bit, even extending from what Neil just said, and just reminding ourselves that for us, for the audience in the room, it's probably 90% our students and faculty, many researchers in the room. And in terms of thinking about this sort of what are we going to do, one of the things that I struggle with as a researcher personally and thinking about what's my research agenda, where is it going, and I'm also doing quite a bit of teaching on climate change these days. But where do you guys really see some of the sort of research needs for supporting the Green New Deal? I think that we've definitely heard around green energy, around sort of new energy technologies, but sort of some of those real gaps, we heard a little bit about the ocean and quite a bit about the ocean as one of our gaps, but I want to just ask if you guys as researchers or sort of folks in a research space could maybe each kind of reflect a little bit on that. And Marshall, could we start with Marshall?
We could start with me, but I don't have an answer in my head yet, but I'll make one up. One of the things that I would say is that, the Green New Deal, look, again, I don't necessarily profess to have the sort of expertise on the right mix of energy, but one of the things that I see in both the weather community that I orbit in, as well as even the climate science space, is there is still sort of a lack of understanding, if you will, of the sort of societal or sociological or human geography, anthropological, psychological connections between these events and marginalized populations or even non-marginalized populations. And I think one of the things that's sort of unique about the Green New Deal is that it's a comprehensive, some say too big, some say not big enough, but it is a comprehensive plan that tries to account for sort of the inequities and marginalized populations, and the fact that my African-American family in Canton, Georgia, who not unlike me, don't have PhDs and the types of things that I kind of orbit in my circle, don't produce large carbon footprints, yet maybe most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we've certainly seen that at global scales as well, in terms of countries that don't account for much of the carbon emissions actually being most vulnerable. So I'd like to see a bit more focus on sort of the societal or social connections, if you will, to climate change. And that's something I told Congress a month ago, just kind of putting on my meteorological hat. something else that I think we have a lack of understanding of just from a weather climate standpoint is sort of the attribution, how current extreme events, we know that they're responding to climate change, but there's still more that we need to know in terms of the research there. And there's something else that I've often talked about, what I call compound events. What I mean by compound events is you have a Hurricane Maria, or you have a California wildfire, but there are compounded sort of events associated with that, in that you have a hurricane, then you have a flooding event afterwards, or you have sort of extreme drought in California, which produces more vegetation and fuel, which then exacerbates wildfires. And so we need a better understanding in that realm of these, what I call compound events.
So this is a really great question, and the way I think the core situation we're in, and Naomi Klein's fantastic book, This Changes Everything, really makes this case, is that we have this problem of spectacular bad timing, which is we have the climate crisis at the same time as we have essentially neoliberalism, market fundamentalism, the loss of an idea of large-scale public transformation for the broader good as a kind of political economic framework. And so we have right now really good technologies for things like renewable energy. I mean, we're not fully there, but we have all these technologies, but we don't have any context of transformative social change at the level of, let's say, the country or the globe. And for that, we have to start looking at other examples. We have to either look into the past, or we have to look at places like maybe Vienna, or we find examples in the US, maybe really successful programs like in California of investing in green jobs in racialized low-income communities. I think the big research need is this kind of really crazy kitchen sink situation where we have to think together, what are the best possible precedents? What are their problems? How can we scale them up very quickly? What would it look like if we got there? And how do we sort of lump it all together? So all the future projections that the IPCC does are just these very skeletal quantitative models, which are fine. But I think socially we have to find some way to cobble together everything that we know about transformative change, many of those examples aren't in the renewable energy context, and then everything we know about decarbonization, and kind of cohere those together into narratives that help us understand the world and to help move people. So it sounds like kind of a lot, but I think the very core idea is like convincing fact-based stories about the huge kinds of transformational change that we can make, and we have to understand that we're going to have to kind of cobble those together from disparate parts, and never stop until we've got a big story that's clear, that's bold, that's transformative, and that takes account of all the mistakes we've made so far. Because we know that we can get to the other end of this. I think there's very, very, very good evidence that we can live better in the 21st century than we did in the last century with all of its horrors. We have to find ways to tell the stories and feed those stories with research about exactly how to get there starting today.
I think that what we've all been talking about today is interdisciplinarity. I mean, the kitchen sink is all of us coming together, right? We come from completely different backgrounds. We have different aspects to this story that we're telling, but we're all telling the same story. We're all concerned with the same things, and we've got to really, I think, rely on those differences to bring everyone together in a way that is powerful and promotes change.
Yeah, I would add that even though she's not physically with us, Molly Crabapple, the wonderful artist who made that video, we need artists to help us with this. That was a big takeaway that we experienced. You know, we knew we wanted to do something related to arts and the Green New Deal. We had no idea the impact it would have, actually, to tell the story in that way. None of us have ever experienced anything like it. That video was viewed by 10 million people in a week. You know, it went viral in a way we've never experienced because of the way in which art can touch people that we can't, frankly, you know, a panel isn't going to do. So, but I just wanted to, in terms of holes, in terms of gaps, I think there are tons of them. We're just beginning, and I love what Ayana said about, you know, this advice. I get this question all the time. What should I do? I'm like, I have no idea. I just met you. How could I possibly know what you should do with the rest of your life? What I do know is that whatever it is, it has to solve this problem, you know, and it's going to take all of our collective skills. So the question, we can't, whatever it is that we think what path we're on, we have to figure out how that path can veer to help solve this problem, which doesn't mean getting off that path. It doesn't mean not doing something you're passionate about. It's about applying it. A couple of things that I've been thinking about around holes in the way we're currently talking about the Green New Deal. I don't think there's nearly enough about care work as climate work. We had an event here at Rutgers that was really well attended a couple of months ago, bringing together teachers and nurses, home care workers, and disability rights advocates, talking about this as low carbon work that doesn't get recognized as a green job because it's overwhelmingly work done by women, overwhelmingly in some cases done by immigrant women. It's the most devalued work in the economy. And so we don't think of it as a green job, but it doesn't burn a lot of carbon, to take care of somebody in their home. And what we're increasingly seeing is those workers are not only low carbon workers, they're first responders in the context of climate disruption. I think there's a big gap around Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous leadership. And this is where I see these warnings from the original Civilian Conservation Corps are really, really important to heed. And there's great language in some of the New Deal policy work around frontline impacted communities, but I don't think it's specific enough about actual leadership and respecting Indigenous knowledge alongside Western science to inform this project. When I read Neil's amazing book, Nature's New Deal, and I really, really recommend that people read it, there are these wonderful pictures in it of the young men of the CCC sitting in their camps in the evenings in the libraries that they built, right? And they're reading books about forest management. And partly this was done to keep the young men out of trouble. I think there was some homophobia, hysteria about what the young men would do alone in the camps because they wouldn't let any women in.
I love that the answer was, we'll just give them more books.
Give them books about forest management. That'll stop them. Anyway, just a side note. But this is why we put that little scene in the film about Indigenous knowledge informing land work, right? It's just a couple seconds. We need to figure out what this would actually look like. What would it look like to not just be reading books about land management, but actually hearing from the Indigenous people whose land they will be on about how to care for that land. So I'll just do a little plug that we're going to have another event at Rutgers on Indigenous knowledge in the Green New Deal, which we're co-organizing with Nick Estes, who's part of this project called the Red Deal, and we're bringing together some great thinkers on this.
I have a few gaps that I want to point out besides the entire ocean. I think there's a lot of research and development that's needed around wave energy. So we kind of have like offshore wind figured out, but haven't had the breakthroughs that are really needed to scale offshore wave energy or coastal wave energy. So that's one sort of straightforward one. Also on this, more broadly, we don't talk about agriculture nearly enough. So land use and agriculture collectively account for about a quarter of emissions by sector because of the way that it's industrialized, because of the way that we're just decimating various ecosystems. And obviously what happens upstream has huge effects on the ocean. So thinking about and the reason why it's a gap is because most of the research on agriculture has been funded by big ag, which clearly has a specific outcome they'd like to see in terms of more fertilizers, which are made by fossil fuels, more pesticides, big monocultures, and that just isn't what the future needs to look like. We need to be restoring our soils so they can sequester more carbon, and we just need more information on exactly how ways we can do that better at scale. So I think there's more research that's needed, supported by the public sector, real solid academic peer-reviewed research on what the future of agriculture could look like, because agriculture does get shout-outs in the Green New Deal, and there's mention of supporting small family farms, which I think is really wonderful. Right now, the average age of a farmer in New York is mid-60s. The last farmer my age that I knew just went bankrupt because we all think that food should be cheap. So just figuring out the food system part, and specifically what could ocean farming look like? This idea of farming seaweed as a way to sequester carbon and to deal with ocean acidification, locally and create local jobs. I mean, the policy memo that I co-authored is about blue jobs. I mean, there's a lot to be said for tackling those problems together. Another one is the need for local scale projections. We've got these great global science and modeling, but a lot of places don't actually know what impacts are coming to their specific town or area. And New York City is really lucky that we have a panel on climate change with these amazing experts who are sort of downscaling the models so that New York City knows what to expect, but most places don't have access to that kind of thing. And the last things are thinking about like the relative importance of various solutions. So it's very easy to get caught up in like, I get yelled at on Twitter all the time for being 95% vegan. And people are like, well, she's not legit because she's 95% vegan. I'm just like, this is not the most important thing, right? Like we need to think really carefully about like, is my 5% the problem that we should be yelling at me about, or should we be focusing on something else? So, like figuring out how to explain the relative importance of things. So we can focus our energies really strategically. And the last is synthesis. I mean, there's so much existing research out there that we need to synthesize. So for students who are thinking about research projects and you don't have enough time or enough funding to collect a whole new data set, thinking about how the existing data sets can be compared to each other, can become interoperable, thinking about meta-analyses and what those can teach us, I think all of those are really important gaps to fill.
Great. So I don't know if there's any follow-up comments on that, but we just crossed over 12:30, so I think we are going to need to wrap things up. And so let me just say thank you, everybody. Thank you. Okay, great. So we're going to shift into, we have lunch available, but just before we break for lunch, just let me make give a few instructions. The poster session this afternoon is going to start at 1 o'clock, and that will be along the concourse. You've probably already seen the posters set up outside. Those will be available, and the room itself will be available till 3 p.m., and the poster session will be running until 3 p.m. And we can, so people, if you want to meet informally and talk in here and so forth, that would be fine. We just want to get, in terms of just starting right now, though, for the folks who are actually presenting posters, if we could just let them grab lunch, and everyone else hold for just a couple minutes. And so if all you folks who are actually going to be presenting, please grab lunch first so that you guys can be ready as people are starting to join you. So, but let me just say, I think again, just say thank you to the panel, thank you to Naomi for the keynote, thank you to everyone for some just wonderful comments this morning.